Tonight, I find myself remembering the Cold War years, the way paranoia drifted through government corridors like cigarette smoke, and how the fear of invisible enemies shaped the rhythm of a nation's darkest decisions. This is the story of Project MKUltra, history as it was lived, unhurried, unpolished, real. If this quiet approach to one of America's most troubling chapters helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history's shadows. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening, and what draws you to these forgotten corners of our past, where science and ethics collided. I remember a time when the boundary between protection and harm became impossibly thin, when laboratories and hospital rooms became theaters for experiments that would have seemed like science fiction, if they weren't so terrifyingly real. This is not a story of heroes and villains, but of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, some wielding power they never should have possessed, others bearing consequences they never deserved. The documents are mostly gone now, fed to flames and shredders in 1973, but enough survived to tell us this. Between 1953 and the mid-1960s, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted a program of human experimentation so extensive, so reckless, and so morally bankrupt that when it was finally exposed, it changed how we think about government power forever. Dim the lights. Let's drift back to a time when the fear of losing our minds to an enemy became the justification for a government that was willing to take them by force. I remember the way fear moved through Washington in those early 1950s, settling into the marble corridors of government buildings like morning fog that never quite burned away. The war was over, but not really, not in the way wars had ended before, with clear victories and defeated armies marching home. This new conflict lived in shadows and whispers, in classified briefings and the hollow echo of footsteps down empty hallways, where men in dark suits carried manila folders stamped with words that made secretaries look away. The Cold War, they called it, though there was nothing cold about the anxiety that gripped the minds of those who believed they were fighting for the soul of civilization itself. I remember how the very air seemed charged with possibility and dread, how every scientific breakthrough carried the weight of potential apocalypse, how every psychological theory might become either salvation or damnation, depending on whose hands shaped it into reality. Back then, in those dim offices where fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune, a particular kind of terror was taking shape. It was not the terror of atomic bombs that was too large, too final, too honest in its destruction. This was something more insidious, more personal. This was the fear that the human mind itself could be captured, rewritten, turned against its own body like a key twisted in a lock, until it opened doors the soul never meant to unlock. The story of what would become Project MKUltra begins not in 1953 with Allen Dulles' authorizing signature, but a decade earlier in the desperate innovations of wartime. I remember how the Office of Strategic Services, that precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, first began its quiet experiments with what they called truth drugs in 1943. The war demanded new weapons, new strategies, new ways of breaking through the barriers that separated enemy secrets from American knowledge. If chemistry could unlock the fortress of the human mind, then chemistry would be their battering ram. The scientists who first mixed those early compounds in their laboratory beakers could not have imagined the decades of suffering their work would eventually enable. They were patriots, after all, good men serving their country in its hour of greatest need. They mixed sodium pentothal with hope and called it patriotic duty. They watched test subjects slip into chemical honesty and believed they were witnessing the birth of a more efficient world, where lies would become impossible and truth would flow like water from a broken dam. But wars end, and the weapons of war do not always die with the peace treaties. When the surrender was signed and the victory parades faded into memory, those truth drug experiments did not disappear into the archives. Instead, they evolved, transformed by the strange new reality of a world where victory had brought not peace, but a more complex and enduring form of conflict. I remember the way the newspapers wrote about Korea, how they described the strange behavior of American prisoners of war who returned home speaking words that sounded rehearsed, confessing to crimes they had never committed, denouncing the very country for which they had been willing to die. The term they used was brainwashing, a word that carried within it all the Cold War's deepest fears made manifest. Here was proof, the headlines suggested, that the communist enemy possessed a weapon more dangerous than any bomber ability to reach inside a man's skull and rearrange the furniture of his soul. The truth, as it always is, was more complicated than the headlines allowed. Those American soldiers had indeed been subjected to psychological pressure, to isolation and manipulation and the slow erosion of their mental defenses. But the techniques used were not the sophisticated mind control methods that American imagination conjured. They were older, simpler tools: hunger, exhaustion, repetition, the basic cruelties that have broken spirits since the first human being realized that pain could be used as currency for compliance. None of this mattered to the men who walked those Washington corridors, who saw in those prisoner confessions the shadow of a terrible new reality. They believed they were witnessing the dawn of an age of psychological warfare, where battles would be fought not with bullets and bombs, but with syringes and electrodes, where victory would belong not to the nation with the strongest army, but to the one that could most effectively dissolve the barrier between mind and will. In 1953, Allen Dulles stood before a group of Princeton alumni and spoke words that would echo through the decades of secret programs and classified experiments that followed. The Soviet Union, he declared, was waging brain warfare against the West, seeking to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis. The communists, he claimed, had developed methods of mental manipulation so advanced that they could transform any man into their unwitting agent, any woman into their obedient servant. We in the West, Dulles continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed himself to be defending civilization itself, are somewhat handicapped in that we have no human guinea pigs of our own on which to try out these extraordinary techniques. The words fell into the Princeton auditorium like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond that academic setting. Here was the Director of Central Intelligence speaking publicly about the need for human experimentation, laying the philosophical groundwork for what would become one of the most extensive programs of illegal research ever conducted by the American government. I remember how those words must have sounded to the men who heard them, how they must have crystallized fears that had been floating formless through the intelligence community like smoke looking for something to cling to. Dulles was not merely describing a threat, he was identifying a solution. If the West lacked human guinea pigs, then human guinea pigs would need to be found. If ethical considerations created handicaps in the race for mental supremacy, then perhaps those ethical considerations were luxuries the free world could not afford. The transition from defensive to offensive thinking did not happen overnight. First came Project Chatter, initiated by the Navy in 1947, a program that marked the first known testing of lysergic acid diethylamide (DLS-DON) human subjects by a United States government agency. The drug was still new then, its effects poorly understood, its potential applications limited only by the imagination of the men who controlled its distribution. In the sterile environment of military research facilities, volunteers and test subjects began their journeys into chemical consciousness alteration, their experiences carefully monitored, their reactions meticulously documented. Following Chatter came Project Bluebird in 1950, launched by the newly formed CIA as part of its expanding mission to protect American interests through whatever means necessity demanded. Bluebird's focus was broader than its Navy predecessor, encompassing not just drug research, but the full spectrum of interrogation, enhancement, and behavioral modification techniques. The scientists and psychiatrists recruited for Bluebird were tasked with answering questions that would have sounded like science fiction only a few years earlier. Could hypnosis be used to create unwitting agents? Could memory be selectively erased and replaced? Could a human being be programmed like a machine to carry out tasks against their conscious will? By August of 1951, Bluebird had evolved into Project Artichoke, reflecting a shift in both scope and ambition. Where Bluebird had sought to enhance interrogation techniques, Artichoke aimed higher, pursuing what its planners called involuntary assassination, the creation of human beings who could be compelled to kill without conscious awareness of their actions. The very name suggested the program's approach. Like the vegetable for which it was named, Artichoke sought to peel away the layers of human consciousness until only the useful core remained. I remember the clinical language that surrounded these early experiments, how the researchers spoke of their test subjects as if they were laboratory equipment rather than human beings with families and dreams and the fundamental right to control their own minds. The reports from that era read like technical manuals, filled with precise measurements of drug dosages and detailed observations of behavioral changes, as if the reduction of human consciousness to a series of chemical reactions could somehow transform the moral weight of what was being done. The progression from Chatter to Bluebird to Artichoke reveals the inexorable logic of classified research programs operating without meaningful oversight. Each project built upon the knowledge gained from its predecessor, each generation of researchers pushing further into territory that their colleagues had deemed too dangerous or too ethically problematic to explore. What began as defensive research, how to protect American personnel from enemy interrogation, techniques gradually transformed into offensive capability development, the pursuit of weapons that could turn the human mind into an instrument of American policy. The world was changing in those years, and with it the very definition of what constituted legitimate government activity. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that science could create weapons of unimaginable destructive power. If physics could split the atom and chemistry could unlock the secrets of DNA, then surely psychology and pharmacology could unlock the secrets of the human mind. The men who authorized these early experiments saw themselves as pioneers, exploring new frontiers in the service of national security, pushing forward the boundaries of human knowledge in the eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny. But frontiers, by their very nature, exist in places where the normal rules do not apply, where the established moral framework has not yet been extended, where actions can be justified by necessity rather than ethics. The researchers who worked on those early mind control projects were operating in such a frontier, a psychological wilderness where the normal protections afforded to human subjects in scientific research had been suspended in the name of national emergency. The irony, which would become clear only much later, was that the communist brain warfare capabilities that had so alarmed Dulles and his colleagues were largely illusory. The prisoner confessions that had sparked such concern were the products not of sophisticated mind control technology, but of time-tested techniques of psychological pressure and physical deprivation. The Americans, in their fear of falling behind in a mind control race, had created a race that existed primarily in their own imagination. Yet, the consequences of that imagination were profoundly real. By the time Alan Dulles signed the authorization for Project MKUltra in April of 1953, the intellectual and institutional foundation had been laid for a program that would span 2 decades, involve hundreds of researchers and thousands of unwitting subjects, and leave a trail of broken minds and shattered lives that would take generations to fully understand. I remember the weight of that moment, though I was not there to witness it directly. I can imagine Dulles in his office, perhaps late in the evening, when the building had grown quiet and the weight of secret decisions settled most heavily on the men who made them. The authorization document was relatively brief, as such things often are, a few pages that would unleash a program of such scope and moral complexity that its full dimensions would not be understood for decades to come. The dawn of Project MKUltra was also the dawn of a new kind of government power, one that recognized no boundary between the public and private spheres, one that claimed the right to experiment on its own citizens in pursuit of weapons that might never be used against foreign enemies, but would certainly be used against domestic populations. It was the dawn of a secret state within the state, operating according to its own logic, justified by threats that were as much products of imagination as of intelligence assessment. In the end, the true tragedy of MKUltra's origins lies not in the program's eventual failures, but in the ease with which democratic institutions and respected academic figures could be recruited to participate in activities that violated the most basic principles of human dignity and scientific ethics. The program succeeded not in creating mind control weapons, but in demonstrating how fear could be weaponized to undermine the very values it claimed to protect. The Cold War would continue for decades after MKUltra was officially terminated, but the precedent it established that national security concerns could justify virtually any violation of individual rights would prove to be one of its most enduring legacies. In seeking to protect the American mind from foreign manipulation, the program's architects had opened the door to domestic manipulation on a scale that would have impressed their supposed communist adversaries. As the program moved from authorization to implementation, from theoretical research to active experimentation, the distance between the noble goals articulated in public speeches and the brutal methods employed in classified facilities would become a chasm that no amount of patriotic rhetoric could bridge. The dawn of psychological warfare had indeed arrived, but its first and most numerous casualties would be found, but its first and most musitals prisons, 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 and recibbles and reserves and reseries is it. Presate with this crispes of women was this with one with on cool on below with what's up what department speaking up I remember the peculiar quality of institutional fluorescent lighting in those government buildings of the 1950s, how it cast everything in a pale clinical glow that seemed to drain the warmth from human faces and leave behind only the sharp angles of ambition and duty. It was under such light that the true architects of Project MKUltra worked, men whose names would be whispered in congressional hearings decades later, whose decisions would echo through the lives of thousands of unwitting subjects whose pursuit of the perfect weapon would reveal the imperfect nature of their own moral reasoning. The program was not born from the collective wisdom of committees or the careful deliberation of democratic institutions. Instead, it emerged from the minds of a handful of individuals who possessed both the scientific knowledge to imagine new forms of human manipulation and the institutional power to transform those imaginings into reality. These were not mad scientists working in isolation, but respected figures operating within the highest levels of American intelligence and academic medicine, their credentials providing cover for activities that would have been condemned if undertaken by anyone with less impressive titles or fewer security clearances. At the operational heart of MKUltra stood a man whose very appearance seemed designed to deflect suspicion from the dark nature of his work. Sidney Gottlieb was a chemist by training, a man who walked with a limp due to a clubfoot, whose speech carried a slight stutter that made him seem more academic than threatening, whose demeanor suggested the absent-minded professor rather than the architect of systematic human experimentation. Yet behind that unassuming exterior worked a mind of extraordinary focus and chilling pragmatism, one that could conceive of human consciousness as simply another chemical system to be analyzed, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. Gottlieb had joined the CIA in 1951. His background in chemistry and his willingness to explore the darker applications of his knowledge making him an ideal candidate for the agency's expanding interest in biological and chemical warfare. By the time Dulles authorized MKUltra, Gottlieb had already established himself as the go-to expert for questions involving the chemical manipulation of human behavior. His colleagues would later describe the extraordinary degree of autonomy he was granted, how he was given what they called free rein, to pursue whatever experimental approaches he deemed necessary, regardless of their impact on the subjects involved. I remember the way his former associates would describe his laboratory at Fort Detrick, how it hummed with the constant activity of chemical synthesis and biological experimentation. Gottlieb's team worked with the methodical precision of industrial chemists, measuring compounds in precise doses, documenting reactions with scientific rigor, treating human consciousness as if it was simply another manufacturing process to be optimized for maximum efficiency. The terrible irony of his approach was that it applied the highest standards of scientific methodology to work that violated the most basic principles of scientific ethics. The philosophical foundation of Gottlieb's work rested on a simple premise. if the human mind could be understood as a biological system, then it could be manipulated using the same techniques that had proven successful in manipulating other biological systems. Drugs that could alter brain chemistry, techniques that could disrupt normal patterns of thought and perception. Methods that could break down the barriers between conscious and unconscious processing. All of these represented potential weapons in what he saw as a struggle for the control of human consciousness itself. His approach was both systematic and ruthless. Where earlier researchers had been constrained by ethical considerations or institutional oversight, Gottlieb operated in an environment where such constraints were seen as obstacles to national security. He pursued his research with the single-minded determination of a man convinced that the fate of Western civilization might depend on his ability to unlock the secrets of mental manipulation, before America's enemies could do the same. Years later, when congressional investigators would finally gain access to some of the surviving documents from his work, they would discover the breadth of his experimentation. Gottlieb had overseen research into dozens of chemical compounds, each tested for its potential to disorient, control, or incapacitate human subjects. He had coordinated with academic researchers across the country, providing funding and materials for experiments that university ethics committees would never have approved if they had known their true purpose. He had maintained careful records of successes and failures, building a database of human vulnerability that represented perhaps the most comprehensive catalogue of mental manipulation techniques ever assembled. The man who provided Gottlieb with both the authority and the resources necessary for such extensive research was Alan Welsh Dulles, a figure whose influence over American intelligence operations during the Cold War era cannot be overstated. Dulles had assumed the directorship of the CIA in February of 1953, bringing with him decades of experience in intelligence work and a philosophical commitment to the idea that America's survival in the Cold War would require the development of new forms of covert capability. I remember the photographs of Dulles from that era, how his white mustache and grandfatherly appearance created an impression of respectability that concealed the revolutionary nature of his vision for American intelligence operations. He believed that the CIA needed to be more than simply a collector of information. It needed to be an active instrument of American policy, capable of influencing events through methods that conventional military or diplomatic approaches could not match. In his view, the development of mind control capabilities represented a natural extension of this philosophy, a way of extending American influence into the most intimate spaces of human consciousness. Dulles's public statements about Soviet brain warfare capabilities were not merely propaganda designed to frighten the American public, though they certainly served that function. They reflected his genuine belief that the Cold War was being fought on psychological as well as political fronts, that victory would ultimately belong to whichever side could most effectively shape human thoughts and perceptions. His authorization of MKUltra represented his conviction that America could not afford to fall behind in what he saw as a race for the ultimate weapon, the ability to control human behavior at its source. The partnership between Dulles and Gottlieb created an institutional framework within which the most extreme forms of human experimentation could be rationalized as patriotic duty. Dulles provided the strategic vision and bureaucratic protection that allowed the program to operate without meaningful oversight, while Gottlieb supplied the technical expertise and moral flexibility necessary to translate that vision into concrete experimental protocols. Together, they created a program that would push the boundaries of acceptable government behavior far beyond anything that had been attempted in American history. Yet the program's most notorious activities would not be conducted within the United States, but across the border in Canada, where a respected psychiatrist named Donald Juan Cameron had unknowingly prepared himself to become one of MKUltra's most valuable collaborators. Cameron's path to involvement in the program illustrates how legitimate academic research could be corrupted by the combination of government funding and ideological commitment to the Cold War struggle. Cameron had established himself as one of North America's most prominent psychiatrists during the 1940s and 50s, as the first chairman of McGill University's Psychiatry Department and the director of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. He commanded respect both within the academic community and among the general public. His reputation rested on his pioneering work in treating mental illness and his advocacy for more humane approaches to psychiatric care. To colleagues and patients alike, he appeared to be exactly what his public persona suggested, a compassionate healer committed to advancing the scientific understanding of mental health. I remember reading his early papers on psychiatric treatment, how they emphasized the importance of treating patients with dignity and respect, how they advocated for therapeutic approaches based on understanding rather than coercion. The man who wrote those papers seemed incapable of the activities that would later be documented at his Montreal facility, where patients seeking help for depression and anxiety would instead become subjects in experiments that would destroy their memories, their personalities, and their capacity for independent thought. The transformation of Cameron from respected psychiatrist to collaborator in illegal human experimentation reveals something disturbing about the institutional pressures of the Cold War era. Like many academics of his generation, Cameron had been deeply affected by the ideological struggle between democracy and communism, and he saw his professional work as part of a larger battle for the future of human civilization. When CIA representatives approached him with funding for research that would contribute to America's psychological warfare capabilities, he appears to have convinced himself that participation in such work represented not a betrayal of his medical ethics, but their ultimate fulfillment. The CIA's recruitment of Cameron also demonstrates the agency's sophisticated understanding of how to co-opt legitimate institutions for illegitimate purposes, rather than establishing their own research facilities, which might have attracted unwanted attention. They chose to work through existing academic and medical institutions whose reputations would provide cover for activities that might otherwise have been questioned. Cameron's status as a respected medical authority made him an ideal collaborator, someone whose involvement would lend credibility to research that might have been rejected if proposed by government scientists working in classified facilities. The relationship between Cameron and his CIA handlers illustrates the corrupting influence of secret government funding on academic research. Cameron was not simply a hired contractor carrying out research designed by intelligence operatives. He was an active collaborator who helped design experiments that pushed far beyond anything that had been attempted in legitimate psychiatric research. His willingness to use his own patients as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust relationship that forms the foundation of medical practice. I remember the clinical language that Cameron used to describe his experimental techniques, how he spoke of depatterning and psychic driving as if they were routine therapeutic procedures rather than systematic attempts to destroy and rebuild human personality. His reports to CIA handlers read like routine medical documentation, filled with precise measurements and objective observations that concealed the horror of what was actually being done to the people under his care. The convergence of these three figures, Gottlieb, with his chemical expertise and moral flexibility, Dulles with his strategic vision and institutional authority, and Cameron with his medical credentials and experimental ambition, created the perfect storm that would drive MKUltra's most notorious activities. Each brought essential capabilities to the program. Gottlieb provided the technical knowledge necessary to design effective experiments. Dulles supplied the political protection and financial resources required to carry them out, and Cameron offered both the medical expertise and the patient population needed to test the results. Together, they created a program that operated according to its own logic, insulated from the ethical constraints that normally govern scientific research and medical practice. The subjects of their experiments were not treated as human beings with inherent rights and dignity, but as raw material for research that served what they believed to be higher purposes. The violation of individual consent was not seen as a moral failing, but as a necessary expedient in the pursuit of weapons that might determine the outcome of the Cold War itself. The personal characteristics that made each of these men effective in their roles also reveal something troubling about the institutional culture that enabled MKUltra's abuses. Gottlieb's scientific detachment allowed him to pursue research without being troubled by its human consequences. Dulles's strategic thinking enabled him to rationalize individual suffering in terms of national necessity. Cameron's medical authority provided legitimacy for activities that violated the most basic principles of medical ethics. None of them appears to have been motivated by personal malice or sadistic impulses. Instead, they were driven by a combination of professional ambition, ideological commitment, and institutional pressure that made them willing to cross moral boundaries that they might have respected under different circumstances. The tragedy of MKUltra's leadership lies not in their exceptional evil, but in their ordinary humanity, in the ease with which respected professionals could be recruited to participate in activities that violated their own stated principles. Their story serves as a reminder that the greatest institutional abuses are often carried out not by obvious criminals, but by people who have convinced themselves that their violations of basic human dignity serve some higher purpose. Years later, when Gottlieb retired from the CIA, he would dismiss his decades of research as useless, acknowledging that the program had failed to achieve any of its stated objectives. By then, however, the damage had been done. Thousands of unwitting subjects had been used as experimental material. Academic institutions had been corrupted by secret government funding, and public trust in both scientific research and government honesty had been undermined in ways that would take decades to repair. The architects of MKUltra had succeeded in creating a program of unprecedented scope and moral complexity, but they had failed to create the mind control weapons that had justified its existence. In the end, their greatest achievement was not the advancement of psychological warfare capabilities, but the demonstration of how easily democratic institutions could be subverted by the very people entrusted with their protection. I remember the way chemical compounds were spoken of in those classified laboratories of the 1950s, how they were discussed not as substances with complex and unpredictable effects on human consciousness, but as tools to be calibrated and deployed with the same precision that military engineers applied to artillery shells. Lysergic acid diethylamidal SDA captured the imagination of MKUltra's architects, not because they understood its mechanisms of action, but precisely because they did not. Here was a substance that could transform human perception in ways that seemed to defy the normal boundaries of chemistry and psychology. A drug that promised to unlock doors in the human mind that had never before been opened. The story of LSD's integration into America's psychological warfare arsenal begins with Albert Hofmann's accidental discovery of its psychoactive properties in 1943, when the Swiss chemist inadvertently absorbed a small amount of the substance through his skin and experienced what he would later describe as the world's first intentional acid trip. But it was the CIA's interpretation of that discovery that transformed a curious pharmaceutical anomaly into what they believed might be the ultimate weapon in the Cold War struggle for human consciousness. By the early 1950s, intelligence analysts had convinced themselves that they were engaged in what one internal document called a race for the mind, a competition with Soviet scientists to develop the most effective methods of psychological manipulation and control. LSD represented their best hope for victory in that race, a substance so powerful in its effects on human perception that even tiny doses measured in micrograms rather than the milligrams, typical of other drugs, could render a person completely unable to distinguish between reality and hallucination. The transformation of LSD from a pharmaceutical curiosity into a weapon of psychological warfare required a fundamental shift in how the CIA understood both the drug and its potential applications. Early research had focused primarily on defensive uses, how to protect American personnel from enemy interrogation techniques that might involve psychoactive substances. But as Gottlieb and his team delved deeper into the drug's effects, they began to envision increasingly aggressive applications that would have seemed like science fiction only a few years earlier. I remember reading the internal memos from that period, how they speak with clinical detachment about the possibility of using LSD to facilitate assassinations of enemy leaders. The idea was elegantly simple in its conception. If a target could be dosed with the drug without their knowledge, they might be rendered so disoriented and paranoid that they could be manipulated into dangerous behavior, or their judgment might be so impaired that they would become vulnerable to conventional forms of attack. The drug's invisible nature rights, lack of taste, odor, or immediate physical effects made it seem ideal for covert operations, where the target's cooperation was neither expected nor desired. The CIA's pursuit of LSD capabilities also reflected their belief that the Soviet Union was engaged in similar research, though the evidence for this assumption was largely circumstantial. Intelligence reports suggested that communist scientists were experimenting with psychoactive substances, and the prisoner confessions that had emerged from the Korean War seemed to demonstrate sophisticated techniques of mental manipulation. Whether or not these assumptions were accurate, they provided the ideological justification for a program of research that would push far beyond the boundaries of acceptable scientific practice. The operational heart of the CIA's SLS-D program was a network of safe houses and research facilities that stretched across the United States, each designed to test the drug's effects under conditions that approximated real-world covert operations. The most notorious of these facilities was established under the code name Operation Midnight Climax, a program that began in 1955 and would continue for nearly a decade, subjecting hundreds of unwitting subjects to experimental doses of LSD, while CIA operatives observed their reactions from behind two-way mirrors. George Hunter White, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics supervisor who oversaw Midnight Climax, had been recruited by Gottlieb specifically for his willingness to operate outside normal, legal and ethical constraints. White's background in narcotics enforcement had given him both the contacts and the moral flexibility necessary to establish what were essentially drug testing facilities, disguised as private residences in San Francisco and New York. These safe houses were equipped with hidden cameras, recording equipment, and observation posts that allowed researchers to document subjects' reactions to LSD without their knowledge. The mechanics of Operation Midnight Climax revealed the casual brutality that characterized much of MKUltra's research methodology. Prostitutes working under White's supervision would lure men to the safe houses with promises of sexual services, then secretly dose their drinks with LSD before engaging in activities that were recorded for later analysis. The subjects' businessmen, tourists, anyone who could be attracted to the houses had no idea that they were participating in a government experiment, no knowledge that their most intimate behaviors were being documented, no recourse when the drug's effects left them disoriented, paranoid, and sometimes permanently damaged. I remember the reports that White filed after each session, how they described the subjects' reactions with the same clinical detachment that might be applied to laboratory animals. Men who had entered the safe houses as willing customers became unwitting test subjects in experiments designed to determine how LSD might be used to extract information, manipulate behavior, or simply incapacitate potential enemies. The prostitutes who administered the drug were themselves subjects of observation, their reactions to repeated LSD exposure documented as part of the research into the substance's long-term effects. The scope of the CIA's SLSD testing extended far beyond the San Francisco safe houses. Gottlieb's team had established research relationships with psychiatric hospitals, federal prisons, and addiction treatment centers across the country, each providing access to populations that were considered suitable for experimental purposes. At the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, addicts seeking treatment were given LSD in exchange for their drug of choice, creating a captive population of subjects who could be dosed repeatedly over extended periods. The Lexington experiments were particularly revealing of the program's disregard for basic human dignity. Patients who had voluntarily sought help for their addiction found themselves subjects in experiments that extended their suffering rather than alleviating it. They were given LSD for periods of up to 77 consecutive days. Their reactions carefully monitored as researchers attempted to determine the drug's potential for breaking down psychological resistance and facilitating interrogation. Similar experiments were conducted at the federal prison in Atlanta, where inmates were offered reduced sentences in exchange for their participation in drug testing programs that they were told were designed to find new treatments for mental illness. The prisoners had no way of knowing that they were actually subjects in weapons research, that their suffering was being documented not to help them but to develop more effective methods of psychological torture. The Atlanta prison experiments illustrate one of MKUltra's most disturbing characteristics: the systematic targeting of populations that lacked both the power to refuse participation and the social standing. necessary to ensure that their suffering would be taken seriously if it were discovered. Prisoners, addicts, psychiatric patients, and the customers of prostitutes were chosen as subjects, not despite their vulnerability, but because of it. They represented what one CIA document described as people who could not fight back, individuals whose disappearance or deterioration was unlikely to attract official attention. The effects of repeated LSD exposure on these unwitting subjects were both immediate and long-lasting. Many experienced severe paranoia, terrifying hallucinations, and complete breaks from reality that lasted for hours or days after the drug's acute effects had worn off. Some never fully recovered, suffering from persistent anxiety, depression, and psychotic episodes that destroyed their ability to function in normal social relationships. The documentation from this period includes numerous cases of subjects who required long-term psychiatric hospitalization after their exposure to experimental doses of LSD. Yet even as evidence mounted that LSD was causing severe and sometimes permanent psychological damage, Gottlieb and his team continued their research with apparently undimmed enthusiasm. They viewed the drug's unpredictability not as a limitation, but as a feature, a characteristic that made it potentially useful for operations where the goal was disruption rather than control. If LSD could not reliably turn subjects into compliant agents, it could at least render them incapable of coherent thought or effective resistance. The program's pursuit of LSD-based weapons also led to some of its most bizarre and ultimately unsuccessful experiments. Researchers investigated the possibility of dispersing the drug through air conditioning systems, contaminating water supplies, or incorporating it into everyday objects that targets might handle without suspicion. They tested aerosol delivery systems, explored methods of concentrating the drug for more efficient dosing, and developed techniques for disguising its administration in food and beverages. None of these delivery methods proved reliable enough for operational use, largely because LSD's effects were too variable to predict with the precision required for covert operations. The same dose that left one subject mildly disoriented might send another into a psychotic break that lasted for weeks. The drug's sensitivity to individual brain chemistry, body weight, and psychological state made it impossible to use with the reliability that field operatives required. The irony of the CIA's LSD program was that its very success in demonstrating the drug's power to alter consciousness also revealed its limitations as a weapon of psychological warfare. By the early 1960s, even Gottlieb had begun to acknowledge that the substance was too unpredictable for the precise applications that the agency had originally envisioned. The decision to wind down the program's LSD research reflected not ethical considerations, but practical ones. The drug simply did not work as advertised. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the CIA's LSD experiments was their inadvertent contribution to the drug's popularization within the American counterculture movement of the 1960s. Some of the volunteers who had participated in early experiments became enthusiastic advocates for the drug's consciousness-expanding potential, introducing it to artists, writers, and musicians who would incorporate it into their creative work and personal philosophy. The most famous example was Ken Kesey, who had volunteered for LSD experiments while a graduate student at Stanford University in the late 1950s. Kesey's experience as a test subject inspired both his novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and his later role as a promoter of psychedelic consciousness through events like the acid tests, multimedia parties that introduced thousands of young Americans to LSD in settings very different from the clinical laboratories where Kessie had first encountered the drug. I remember the strange historical irony that this represented, a substance developed as a weapon for controlling human consciousness, became instead a catalyst for a social movement built around the expansion of consciousness and the rejection of institutional authority. The same drug that the CIA had hoped would make people more compliant instead inspired a generation to question the legitimacy of the very institutions that had developed it. By 1963, the CIA had largely abandoned its efforts to weaponize LSD, though stockpiles of the drug were maintained for potential future use, and research into related substances continued under other program names. The official termination of LSD research within MKUltra reflected a grudging acknowledgement that the substance was too unpredictable to serve the agency's operational needs, but it did not represent any fundamental questioning of the program's ethical foundation. The legacy of the LSD experiments would extend far beyond their official termination. The techniques developed for covert drug administration, the methods refined for observing subjects without their knowledge, and the institutional frameworks created for conducting research without meaningful oversight would all be adapted for other purposes as the intelligence community's interest shifted from mind control to more conventional forms of psychological manipulation and torture. The decade-long pursuit of LSD-based weapons had failed to achieve its stated objectives, but it had succeeded in establishing dangerous precedents for government experimentation on unwitting subjects. It had demonstrated that respected academic institutions could be corrupted by secret funding, that medical professionals could be recruited to violate their ethical obligations, and that democratic oversight could be bypassed through the simple expedient of classifying illegal activities as matters of national security. Most troubling of all, the LSD experiments had revealed the ease with which human subjects could be reduced to mere research materials in the pursuit of weapons that served no clear strategic purpose beyond the satisfaction of scientific curiosity and institutional ambition. I remember the first time I heard the term Depatterning, spoken in the hushed tones that psychiatrists reserve for their most ambitious theories. It was 1957, and the word carried with it the promise of revolutionary therapeutic breakthrough, technique that could strip away the accumulated damage of mental illness and return patients to a blank slate from which healthy patterns of thought could be rebuilt. But like so many concepts that emerged from MKUltra's laboratories, Depatterning would reveal itself to be less a tool of healing than an instrument of systematic psychological destruction. The mechanical buzz of electroshock machines became the soundtrack of this new phase of experimentation, a sound that patients would learn to fear with the same visceral dread that Pavlov's dogs felt at the ringing of a bell. These were not the carefully calibrated treatments that legitimate psychiatrists used to address severe depression or catatonia, but rather an industrial application of electrical current designed to shatter the architecture of human consciousness with the efficiency of a wrecking ball. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, who had assumed control of the psychiatric research arm of MKUltra, understood that the agency's failure to achieve reliable mind control through chemical means required a more fundamental approach to the problem of human consciousness. If LSD and other drugs could not reliably rewrite a person's thoughts and loyalties, perhaps the solution lay in first erasing those thoughts entirely, creating a psychological tabula rasa upon which new patterns of behavior could be inscribed with scientific precision. The concept of depatterning drew its theoretical foundation from Cameron's interpretation of Pavlovian conditioning, combined with his own observations of patients suffering from severe psychiatric conditions. He had noticed that individuals experiencing complete psychotic breaks sometimes emerged from their episodes with dramatically altered personalities, as if their mental illness had somehow reset their fundamental patterns of thought and behavior. What intrigued Cameron was not how to prevent such psychological destruction, but how to induce it deliberately and control the reconstruction process that followed. The Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal became the primary laboratory for these experiments. Its Gothic architecture and prestigious reputation providing perfect camouflage for research that would have been impossible to conduct openly in any legitimate medical setting. Cameron had transformed what was ostensibly a treatment center for wealthy patients seeking discreet psychiatric care into a workshop for the systematic disassembly of human personality. I remember reading the clinical notes from that period, how they described the depatterning process with the same methodical precision that a mechanic might use to document the disassembly of an engine. Phase 1 involved what Cameron termed psychic driving, the continuous playback of recorded messages designed to break down the patient's existing thought patterns through relentless repetition. Patients would be fitted with specially designed helmets that delivered these messages directly into their ears for periods that extended from hours to days. The same phrases repeated thousands of times until the words lost all meaning and the mind began to fracture under the assault. The messages themselves were crafted with diabolical sophistication, designed not to convey information but to induce psychological collapse. A patient might hear their own voice recorded during therapy sessions, repeating their deepest fears and self-criticisms in an endless loop. Others were subjected to recordings that challenged their most fundamental beliefs about themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world, delivered with the mechanical persistence that made human resistance impossible. The headphones that delivered these messages were not the comfortable devices that patients could remove at will, but rather restraining mechanisms that ensured continuous exposure to the psychological bombardment. Patients reported that the constant stream of words and phrases began to lose coherence after the first few hours, becoming instead a kind of auditory torture that made sleep impossible and coherent thought increasingly difficult. Phase 2 of the depatterning process involved the systematic application of electroconvulsive therapy at intensities and frequencies that far exceeded any legitimate medical protocol, where conventional ECT might involve a single treatment every few days. Cameron's patients received multiple sessions daily, sometimes as many as 6 electroshock treatments in a 24-hour period. The electrical current was calibrated not to provide therapeutic benefit, but to induce massive disruption of neural activity, creating what Cameron described as differential amnesia that could selectively erase specific memories while leaving basic physiological functions intact. The electroshock machines used in these experiments were modified to deliver currents far more powerful than those approved for medical use. Their electrical output measured not by therapeutic effectiveness, but by the completeness of the amnesia they produced. Patients who underwent intensive depatterning often lost not just their memories of recent events, but their fundamental sense of personal identity, forgetting their names, their relationships, and even basic skills like reading and writing. The muffled silence of sensory deprivation chambers represented the third phase of Cameron's systematic approach to psychological destruction. These isolation tanks, inspired by research conducted by Donald Habe at McGill University, were designed to eliminate all external stimuli and force the mind to confront the void of its own consciousness. Patients were placed in soundproof chambers, often for periods extending from days to weeks, their senses systematically deprived of any input that might help maintain their connection to external reality. The sensory deprivation chambers were engineered with the same attention to detail that characterized all of MKUltra's experimental apparatus. Temperature was maintained at precisely body heat to eliminate thermal sensations. Lighting was either completely absent or provided by dim red bulbs that offered no visual reference points. Sound was eliminated through both soundproofing and the continuous playing of white noise that masked any auditory cues from the outside world. Even tactile sensations were minimized through the use of specially designed gloves and booties that reduced the patient's ability to feel their own body. I remember the reports that documented patients' responses to prolonged sensory deprivation, how they describe a progressive dissolution of the boundary between self and environment that often culminated in complete psychological breakdown. Subjects would begin to hallucinate within hours of isolation, their minds creating elaborate sensory experiences to fill the void left by the absence of external stimuli. These hallucinations would become increasingly vivid and terrifying as the isolation continued, until patients could no longer distinguish between their internal fantasies and external reality. The combination of psychic driving, intensive electroshock, and sensory deprivation created what Cameron termed complete Depatterning, a state in which patients exhibited what he described as primary infantile behavior. Subjects who had undergone the full sequence of treatments would lose their ability to control basic bodily functions, forget how to eat or dress themselves, and revert to a state of complete dependence. That Cameron believed represented the successful erasure of their previous personality structure. What made these experiments particularly horrifying was not just their systematic brutality, but the clinical enthusiasm with which Cameron and his colleagues documented their subjects' psychological destruction. The case files from Allen Memorial Institute read like inventories of human demolition, cataloging each stage of personality disintegration with the same methodical precision that might be applied to a controlled demolition. Patients were reduced to clinical observations. Subject exhibits complete retrograde amnesia extending back approximately 15 years, or patient demonstrates loss of speech, function, and requires assistance with basic motor skills. The connection between Cameron's depatterning techniques and the CIA's broader mind. Control objectives became explicit in the development of what would later become the Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. The psychological principles discovered through the systematic destruction of psychiatric patients at Allen Memorial Institute were codified into a training document that would guide CIA interrogation practices for decades to come. The techniques of sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and psychological disorientation that had been perfected on unwitting mental patients became standard tools in the agency's arsenal of coercive interrogation methods. The hypnosis experiments that accompanied Cameron's depatterning research represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt to achieve the Manchurian candidate scenario that had long obsessed MKUltra's planners. The theory was elegantly simple. If a subject's personality could be completely erased through depatterning, the blank slate that remained might be susceptible to hypnotic programming that could install new patterns of loyalty and behavior. Patients who had been reduced to infantile states through intensive treatment were subjected to prolonged hypnotic sessions designed to implant new identities, political beliefs, and behavioral patterns. I remember reading the transcripts of these hypnotic sessions, how they reveal the systematic nature of the personality reconstruction that Cameron and his colleagues attempted to achieve. Subjects who had been stripped of their memories and identities were told elaborate stories about their past, given new names and histories, and programmed with specific responses to particular triggers or commands. The hypnotists worked with the patience of sculptors, carefully building new personalities layer by layer in minds that had been systematically emptied of their original contents. The quest for reliable hypnotic control led to some of the program's most elaborate and ultimately unsuccessful experiments. Researchers investigated the possibility of creating multiple personalities within a single subject, compartmentalizing different aspects of consciousness so that an individual could function normally in their daily life while maintaining a separate programmed identity that could be activated for specific operations. They explored techniques for implanting false memories so convincing that subjects would be willing to act on information they believed to be true, but which had been artificially constructed. None of these hypnotic programming attempts proved reliable enough for operational use, largely because the human mind demonstrated a remarkable resilience in the face of even the most systematic attempts at reconstruction. Patients who had been depatterned to the point of complete amnesia would often begin spontaneously recovering fragments of their original memories, their personalities reasserting themselves despite the intensive efforts to erase and reprogram them. The hypnotic suggestions that seemed to take hold during treatment sessions would fade or be actively resisted once subjects were removed from the controlled environment of the laboratory. The mechanical precision that characterized Cameron's approach to psychological destruction reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of human consciousness that ran throughout MKUltra's research program. The assumption that personality and memory could be disassembled and reconstructed like the components of a machine revealed a deeply mechanistic view of human psychology that failed to account for the complex, interconnected nature of consciousness and identity. Yet even as evidence mounted that depatterning could not achieve its stated objectives of creating controllable subjects, the research continued with apparent enthusiasm from both Cameron and his CIA sponsors. The program's focus gradually shifted from mind control to what internal documents described as defensive research, the development of techniques that could be used to extract information from prisoners or to create states of psychological vulnerability that might facilitate more conventional forms of interrogation. The systematic nature of the depatterning experiments also revealed the extent to which MKUltra had succeeded in corrupting legitimate medical institutions. Allen Memorial Institute was not a covert CIA facility, but rather a respected psychiatric hospital affiliated with McGill University, an institution that had built its reputation on advancing the scientific understanding of mental illness. Cameron himself was not a shadowy intelligence operative, but rather a prominent psychiatrist who had served as president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the World Psychiatric Association. The transformation of Cameron from healer to torturer illustrates one of MKUltra's most disturbing legacies: the demonstration that respected professionals could be recruited to violate their most fundamental ethical obligations through a combination of financial incentives, intellectual flattery, and institutional protection. The same techniques that Cameron used to destroy the personalities of his patients were presented in professional publications as innovative therapeutic approaches. Their true purpose hidden behind a veil of academic respectability. I remember the patient records that documented the long-term consequences of depatterning for those who survived the treatment. Many never recovered their original memories or personalities, spending the remainder of their lives in a state of confused, partial amnesia that made normal relationships impossible. Others experienced persistent anxiety, depression, and episodes of dissociation that suggested permanent damage to their psychological infrastructure. The few who did recover sufficiently to function independently often retained traumatic memories of their treatment that haunted them for decades. The institutional framework that enabled Cameron's experiments also revealed the broader corruption of oversight. Mechanisms that should have prevented such systematic abuse. The research was funded through legitimate academic grants that disguised the CIA's involvement, reviewed by hospital administrators who were either complicit in the deception or too intimidated to challenge Cameron's authority, and conducted with the knowledge and tacit approval of academic colleagues who valued institutional prestige more than patient welfare. The Depatterning experiments at Allen Memorial Institute would eventually become the subject of extensive litigation, with survivors and their families seeking both compensation and acknowledgement of the violations they had endured. But the legal proceedings also revealed the extent to which the institutional mechanisms that should have protected patients had been systematically compromised. Hospital records had been altered or destroyed, funding sources had been deliberately obscured, and the professional networks that should have provided oversight had instead provided cover for increasingly extreme violations of medical ethics. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Cameron's techniques had been exported to other institutions, adapted for different populations, and incorporated into training programs for intelligence operatives and military personnel. The principles of systematic psychological destruction that had been perfected on psychiatric patients at Allen Memorial Institute became part of a broader toolkit of coercive techniques that would be employed in conflicts around the world for decades to come. The mechanical buzz of electroshock machines and the muffled silence of sensory deprivation chambers had created more than just individual tragedies. They had established new precedents for the systematic application of psychological torture under the guise of scientific research. The Depatterning experiments demonstrated that human consciousness was indeed fragile enough to be shattered by sufficiently intensive assault, even if it could not be rebuilt according to the specifications of its destroyers. By the early 1960s, even Cameron had begun to acknowledge that complete personality reconstruction remained beyond the reach of existing psychological techniques. The depatterning process could reliably destroy existing patterns of thought and behavior, but the creation of new, controllable personalities proved to be far more complex than the mechanical model of consciousness had suggested. The human mind's capacity for spontaneous recovery and resistance exceeded the parameters that had been built into the experimental protocols. I remember the antiseptic corridors of Allen Memorial Institute, how they stretched through the converted mansion like arteries carrying the lifeblood of respectability through what had become a factory of psychological destruction. The building itself seemed to embody the dual nature of Cameron's enterprise, its elegant Victorian facade, suggesting healing and refuge, while its basement laboratories hummed with the machinery of systematic human experimentation. Here, in the shadow of Mount Royal, the CIA had found the perfect partner for research that was too extreme even for the classified laboratories of Fort Detrick. The endless loop of recorded voices that echoed through those corridors represented more than just another experimental technique. They were the sound of international collaboration in the service of psychological warfare. Subproject 68, as it was designated in the CIA's filing system, marked the agency's first successful attempt to export its mind control research beyond American borders, establishing a template for covert cooperation that would be replicated in facilities around the world. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron's transformation from respected psychiatrist to CIA contractor had been facilitated by a combination of professional ambition, intellectual arrogance, and the unique opportunities presented by Canada's more permissive approach to psychiatric research. Unlike their American counterparts, Canadian medical institutions operated with less oversight and fewer legal constraints, creating an environment where experimental techniques that would have been impossible to implement in the United States could be tested with impunity. The relationship between Cameron and the CIA had been carefully cultivated over several years, beginning with his participation in psychiatric evaluations of Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials, his work in assessing the psychological state of Rudolf Hess and other defendants had brought him to the attention of intelligence officials, who were impressed by his apparent ability to penetrate the minds of enemy agents and extract information through sophisticated psychological techniques. By 1957, when Subproject 68 was formally established, Cameron had already begun experimenting with the techniques that would make Allen Memorial Institute notorious. The CIA's funding provided not just financial support, but also access to a network of researchers, facilities, and experimental subjects that transformed what had been individual initiative into systematic institutional program. The $69,000 that the agency provided through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology represented only a fraction of Cameron's total research budget, but it came with resources and protection that money alone could not have purchased. I remember reading the grant proposals that Cameron submitted to justify his funding, how they described his research in language that carefully obscured its true purpose while highlighting its potential applications for intelligence work. The official objective was stated as the investigation of the factors involved in the production of prolonged amnesia, but the underlying goals were far more ambitious. Cameron believed that he could develop techniques for completely erasing a person's existing personality and replacing it with new patterns of thought and behavior that would make them essentially different people. The patients who became subjects in these experiments were drawn from the same vulnerable populations that MKUltra had targeted throughout its existence. Individuals seeking treatment for psychiatric conditions who had neither the knowledge nor the power to refuse participation in research that went far beyond any legitimate therapeutic purpose. Many were wealthy patients who had come to Allen Memorial Institute precisely because of its reputation for discreet, innovative treatment, never suspecting that their trust would be rewarded with systematic psychological torture. The mechanics of Cameron's psychic driving technique revealed the industrial scale at which psychological destruction could be implemented, when sufficient resources and institutional protection were available. Patients were placed in specially constructed rooms where recorded messages could be played continuously for periods extending from days to months. These were not therapeutic recordings designed to promote healing, but rather carefully crafted psychological weapons designed to break down the subject's sense of reality and personal identity. The recording studios at Allen Memorial Institute were equipped with technology that was advanced even by the standards of professional broadcasting facilities. Their equipment, funded through CIA contracts that ensured access to the most sophisticated audio equipment available. The messages themselves were recorded using the patient's own voices, captured during therapy sessions, and then edited into repetitive loops that transformed their own words into psychological torture. I remember the transcripts of these recordings, how they reveal the systematic nature of the assault on human consciousness that Cameron had designed. A patient suffering from depression might hear their own voice repeating phrases like "you are a failure" or "nobody loves you" thousands of times. The repetition gradually stripping away any ability to distinguish between the recorded voice and their own internal thoughts. Others were subjected to recordings that contradicted their most fundamental beliefs about themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. The drug-induced comas that accompanied psychic driving represented, perhaps, the most extreme violation of medical ethics in the entire MKUltra program. Patients were kept unconscious for periods that extended from weeks to months, their bodies maintained by intravenous feeding while their minds were subjected to continuous psychological bombardment. The combination of prolonged unconsciousness and auditory assault created what Cameron termed differential amnesia, a state in which recent memories could be selectively erased while leaving older memories intact. The pharmaceutical cocktails that induced these comas were far more complex than simple anesthetics, involving combinations of barbiturates, amphetamines, and hallucinogens that were calibrated to maintain unconsciousness while keeping the brain sufficiently active to process the recorded messages being played through headphones. The dosages required constant adjustment based on individual patient responses, creating a delicate balance between therapeutic unconsciousness and fatal overdose that several subjects did not survive. The medical staff at Allen Memorial Institute who participated in these experiments included nurses, technicians, and junior physicians who were told that they were participating in cutting-edge research designed to develop new treatments for severe psychiatric conditions. Most had no knowledge of the CIA funding or the true purpose of the techniques they were implementing, creating a hierarchy of complicity that insulated Cameron from direct responsibility for the day-to-day brutality of the program. The violation of medical ethics that these experiments represented went far beyond the absence of informed consent to encompass a systematic betrayal of the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between healer and patient. The Nuremberg Code, established in response to Nazi medical experiments, had explicitly prohibited research that involved significant risk to subjects without their knowledge and consent. Cameron, who had participated in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals for similar violations, was now implementing techniques that differed from those condemned at Nuremberg only in their sophisticated psychological focus rather than crude physical brutality. The connection between Subproject 68 and the broader MKUltra program was maintained through regular visits by CIA personnel who monitored the progress of experiments and provided guidance on research priorities. Sidney Gottlieb himself made several trips to Montreal, reviewing patient files and offering suggestions for modifications to experimental protocols. These visits were carefully documented in CIA records that would later provide crucial evidence of American involvement in what the Canadian government would eventually acknowledge as systematic human rights violations. I remember the case files that documented the experiences of individual patients, how they revealed the personal dimensions of what might otherwise seem like abstract discussions of experimental methodology. Linda MacDonald, a young mother who had sought treatment for postpartum depression, was subjected to 102 days of continuous sleep therapy combined with intensive electroshock treatment that erased virtually all of her memories. When she finally regained consciousness, she could not recognize her husband or children, could not remember how to read or write, and required years of rehabilitation to regain basic social functioning. The case of Val Orlico, wife of a Canadian Member of Parliament, illustrated the extent to which even politically connected families were not safe from Cameron's experiments. Orlico had been referred to Allen Memorial Institute for treatment of depression following a difficult pregnancy. But instead of receiving conventional therapy, she was subjected to intensive depatterning that left her with permanent memory loss and psychological damage. Her husband's subsequent investigation of her treatment would become one of the first public exposures of the CIA's involvement in Canadian psychiatric research. The institutional framework that enabled these experiments also revealed the extent to which legitimate medical organizations could be corrupted by secret funding and the promise of scientific advancement. Allen Memorial Institute was affiliated with McGill University, one of Canada's most prestigious academic institutions, and Cameron held appointments in both psychiatry and psychology that gave him access to graduate students and junior researchers, who could be recruited into his experimental programs without fully understanding their purpose. The research conducted under Subproject 68 also provided valuable intelligence about the limits and possibilities of psychological manipulation that informed CIA operations far beyond the psychiatric hospitals where the techniques were tested. The principles of sensory deprivation, repetitive psychological assault, and pharmacological manipulation that were perfected at Allen Memorial Institute became standard components of interrogation protocols that would be used in conflicts around the world. The documentation from this period reveals the systematic nature of the knowledge transfer between Cameron's laboratory and CIA operational units. Detailed reports describing the psychological effects of various experimental techniques were circulated among intelligence officials, providing a scientific foundation for coercive interrogation methods that would be employed for decades to come. The clinical language used in these reports disguised techniques that amounted to sophisticated torture, describing human suffering in terms of behavioral modification and therapeutic intervention. The Canadian government's complicity in these experiments extended beyond simple inaction to include active institutional support for research that violated both Canadian law and international agreements on human rights. Officials at multiple levels of government were aware of Cameron's research and its CIA funding, but chose to prioritize the perceived benefits of scientific advancement over the rights of individual patients. This institutional failure would eventually result in formal government apologies and financial settlements, but only after decades of legal battles by survivors and their families. The techniques developed through Subproject 68 also contributed to the broader evolution of psychological warfare doctrine within the intelligence community. The systematic methods of personality destruction that Cameron had perfected provided a scientific foundation for operations designed to neutralize enemy agents, discredit political opponents, and extract information from resistant subjects. These techniques would be adapted for use in military conflicts, covert operations, and domestic surveillance programs that extended far beyond their original psychiatric context. I remember the progress reports that Cameron submitted to his CIA handlers, how they described the systematic destruction of human personality with the same clinical detachment that might be applied to the demolition of a building. Patients were reduced to behavioral observations and psychological measurements, their suffering quantified in terms of memory loss, personality change, and degree of dependency. The human cost of these experiments was systematically obscured behind layers of scientific terminology and institutional authority. The international dimensions of Subproject 68 also established important precedents for CIA cooperation with foreign intelligence services and research institutions. The successful implementation of the Canadian program demonstrated that American mind control research could be exported to allied countries where different legal and ethical constraints might permit experiments that would be impossible to conduct on American soil. This model would later be replicated in other countries, creating a global network of facilities where CIA-funded research could be conducted with minimal oversight. The end of Subproject 68 in 1964 reflected not ethical concerns about the treatment of patients, but rather practical disappointment with the results of Cameron's experiments. Despite years of intensive research and the systematic destruction of hundreds of human lives, the techniques developed at Allen Memorial Institute had failed to achieve reliable control over human behavior. Patients who had been completely depatterned often began spontaneously recovering their original personalities, and attempts to implant new behavioral patterns through hypnosis and repetitive conditioning proved unreliable under real-world conditions. The legacy of the Canadian connection would extend far beyond the formal termination of CIA funding, creating precedents for international cooperation in human experimentation that would influence intelligence operations for decades to come. The institutional relationships established through Subproject 68 provided a template for similar programs in other countries, while the techniques developed at Allen Memorial Institute became standard components of interrogation, training for military and intelligence personnel. The quiet horror of these institutional settings, with their combination of medical authority and systematic brutality, revealed the particular dangers posed by programs that operated under the cover of scientific research and therapeutic intervention. The patients who suffered through Cameron's experiments were victimized, not just by individual cruelty, but by entire institutional systems that had been corrupted in the service of intelligence objectives that bore no relationship to their ostensible mission of healing. The antiseptic corridors of Allen Memorial Institute had become pathways through a landscape of systematic psychological destruction. Their clinical atmosphere masking violations of human dignity that would have seemed impossible in legitimate medical settings. The endless loop of recorded voices that echoed through those halls represented more than experimental technique. They were the sound of human consciousness being systematically dismantled in the service of geopolitical ambitions that reduced individual suffering to mere data points in classified research files. Even after the termination of Subproject 68, the principles and techniques developed during its operation would resonate throughout intelligence agencies worldwide. Manuals, training guides, and internal reports circulated for decades, embedding the lessons learned in the operational culture of psychological manipulation and interrogation. The Canadian program became a cautionary tale, demonstrating both the technical potential and the profound human cost of coercive psychological research. The story of Subproject 68, while confined to the antiseptic halls of Allen Memorial Institute in its execution, had implications that stretched far beyond its immediate victims. It highlighted the dangers inherent in the intersection of scientific ambition, government secrecy, and institutional complicity. The echoes of Cameron's work in Canada would reverberate for decades, leaving a permanent imprint on both the fields of psychiatry and intelligence operations. I remember the sound of hospital gurneys on linoleum floors, their wheels creating a rhythmic percussion that became the soundtrack of institutional betrayal. In those corridors, where healing should have been the only purpose, men and women were wheeled toward procedures that would strip away their memories, their personalities, and sometimes their capacity for human connection itself. The helpless confusion of awakening without memory would become a recurring theme in the testimonies of those who survived MKUltra's systematic assault on human consciousness, their stories revealing the personal dimensions of what might otherwise remain buried in classified files and clinical abstractions. The selection of subjects for these experiments was not random, but rather followed patterns that reflected both practical considerations and deeper assumptions about whose suffering mattered in the calculus of national security. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, the desperate and the disposable, these were the populations that Sidney Gottlieb and his colleagues identified as suitable raw material for research that required subjects who could not fight back, as one internal CIA document candidly acknowledged. The systematic targeting of the vulnerable revealed not just tactical opportunism, but a moral framework that had reduced certain categories of human beings to the status of laboratory animals. The federal prisons that served as recruiting grounds for MKUltra experiments offered a captive population of subjects whose legal status made informed consent essentially meaningless. At the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, inmates were offered reduced sentences, better food, or access to recreational privileges in exchange for participation in what they were told were medical studies designed to develop new treatments for addiction and mental illness. The prisoners had no way of knowing that they were actually volunteering to test weapons designed to break human minds, that their suffering would be documented not to help them, but to develop more effective methods of psychological coercion. I remember reading the recruitment materials that were distributed in these prisons, how they promised participants that they would be contributing to important scientific research while receiving excellent medical care. The language was carefully crafted to exploit the desperation of men who had been stripped of their freedom and were willing to accept any opportunity for better treatment or earlier release. The consent forms they signed were elaborate legal documents that appeared to provide comprehensive protection for their rights, while actually authorizing procedures that would cause severe and sometimes permanent psychological damage. The The psychiatric hospitals that provided subjects for MKUltra research represented an even more troubling violation of the trust that should exist between healers and patients. Institutions like the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, the Lexington Narcotics Hospital in Kentucky, and dozens of smaller facilities across North America became recruitment centers for experiments that transformed the seeking of help into an invitation to systematic abuse. Patients who had voluntarily admitted themselves for treatment of depression, anxiety, or addiction found themselves subjected to procedures that were designed not to heal, but to test the limits of psychological endurance. The case of Esther Schreier illustrates the devastating personal impact of these institutional betrayals on individual lives and families. Schreier had sought treatment at Allen Memorial Institute in 1959 for depression following the death of her husband, trusting that the hospital's prestigious reputation would ensure she received the best possible care. Instead, she became subject number 7 in Cameron's Depatterning experiments, undergoing intensive electroshock therapy and drug-induced comas that erased decades of memories and left her unable to recognize her own children. The clinical notes that documented Schreier's treatment read like a methodical catalogue of psychological destruction. Day after day, the reports tracked the systematic erasure of her personality, loss of recent memory, inability to recognize familiar objects, regression to infantile behavior patterns. The same detached scientific language that might be used to document the effects of a chemical reaction was applied to the destruction of a human mind, reducing her suffering to data points in an experimental protocol. Schreier's family watched helplessly as the woman they had known disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to inhabit the same body but had lost access to the experiences and relationships that had defined her identity. Her children, already traumatized by their father's death, found themselves effectively orphaned by a treatment that had destroyed their mother's ability to remember their shared history or provide the emotional support they desperately needed. The recovery process, such as it was, would extend over years as Schreier slowly rebuilt fragments of her identity from the ruins that Cameron's experiments had left behind. She would never fully recover her memories of her children's early years, her marriage, or the person she had been before entering Allen Memorial Institute. The institutional abandonment that followed her release compounded the original violation, as the hospital disclaimed responsibility for her condition and provided no ongoing support for her rehabilitation. The deliberate targeting of populations who could not fight back reflected a systematic analysis of power relationships that extended far beyond individual institutions to encompass broader patterns of social vulnerability. African American prisoners in the South, Native American patients on reservations, immigrants with limited English skills, the elderly in state institutions. These were the groups that MKUltra researchers identified as ideal subjects precisely because their marginalized status made their suffering less likely to attract attention or generate consequences for those who caused it. The Lexington Narcotics Hospital provided a particularly clear example of how social vulnerability could be weaponized in the service of experimental research. Patients who had voluntarily sought treatment for drug addiction were offered their substance of choice in exchange for participation in LSD experiments that often extended for months. The hospital's patient population consisted largely of poor African American men whose addiction had brought them into contact with the criminal justice system, creating a captive population whose continued access to drugs depended on their willingness to serve as experimental subjects. I remember the treatment records from Lexington that documented patients receiving LSD for 77 consecutive days, their reactions carefully monitored as researchers attempted to determine the drug's potential for facilitating interrogation and behavioral control. The subjects had no way of knowing that their participation in what they believed were addiction. Treatment programs was actually contributing to the development of torture techniques that would be used against prisoners and political dissidents around the world. The violation of informed consent that characterized these experiments went far beyond simple deception to encompass a systematic subversion of the ethical principles that were supposed to govern medical research. The Nuremberg Code, established in response to Nazi medical experiments, had explicitly required that subjects give voluntary consent based on full knowledge of the risks and purposes of any research in which they participated. MKUltra systematically violated every principle of this code, using deception, coercion, and institutional authority to recruit subjects for experiments that posed severe risks while serving no legitimate medical purpose. The long-term consequences for survivors revealed the enduring impact of psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate effects of the experimental procedures. Many subjects developed chronic anxiety, depression, and episodes of dissociation that made normal relationships impossible. Others experienced persistent memory problems, personality changes, and psychotic episodes that required ongoing psychiatric treatment. The institutional mechanisms that should have provided support for these survivors were either non-existent or actively hostile, leaving victims to cope with the consequences of their abuse without acknowledgement or assistance. The families of MKUltra subjects often became secondary victims of experiments that destroyed not just individual minds, but entire networks of relationships and support. Children watched their parents disappear into psychiatric facilities and return as fundamentally different people, unable to provide the emotional consistency and security that family relationships require. Spouses found themselves married to strangers who had lost the memories and personality traits that had originally brought them together. The case of Harold Blauer illustrates the extreme end of MKUltra's disregard for human life and dignity. Blauer, a tennis pro who had sought treatment for depression following his divorce, was injected with massive doses of mescaline at the New York Psychiatric Institute without his knowledge or consent. The experimental dosages caused his death within hours. But hospital officials covered up the circumstances of his death and told his family that he had died of natural causes. It would take decades of investigation by his surviving daughter before the true circumstances of his death were revealed. The institutional frameworks that enabled these experiments also revealed the extent to which respected medical professionals could be recruited to violate their most fundamental ethical obligations. Doctors, nurses, and researchers who had taken oaths to first do no harm became participants in systematic programs of psychological torture. Their professional authority used to legitimize procedures that would have been recognized as criminal if conducted outside medical settings. The corruption of medical ethics that MKUltra represented was not limited to a few rogue practitioners, but extended throughout institutional hierarchies that included hospital administrators, university officials, and professional organizations. The American Psychiatric Association, which should have provided ethical oversight for the profession, remained largely silent about experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, prioritizing institutional prestige and research funding over patient welfare. I remember the testimony of surviving subjects who appeared before congressional committees in the 1970s, how their accounts of systematic abuse were often dismissed or minimized by officials, who seemed more concerned with protecting institutional reputations than acknowledging the scope of the violations that had been committed. The victims were frequently portrayed as mentally ill individuals whose testimony could not be trusted, their credibility undermined by the very psychiatric conditions that had made them vulnerable to experimental abuse in the first place. The legal battles that followed the exposure of MKUltra revealed additional layers of institutional betrayal, as government agencies fought to minimize their financial liability, while avoiding acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Survivors and their families faced years of litigation against defendants who had access to unlimited legal resources and the protection of national security classifications that prevented full disclosure of the evidence. Many victims died before their cases could be resolved, their suffering unacknowledged and their families left without compensation. The documentation of individual cases also revealed patterns of experimentation that suggested systematic research programs rather than isolated incidents of abuse. Similar techniques were employed across multiple institutions. Experimental protocols were refined based on the results obtained at different facilities, and researchers shared information about effective methods for psychological manipulation and control. The coordination of these activities required institutional support that extended from individual hospitals to university research departments to federal agencies. The children who were subjected to MKUltra experiments represented perhaps the most shocking violation of ethical principles in the entire program. Researchers at institutions like the Allen Memorial Institute conducted experiments on children as young as 6 years old, subjecting them to the same techniques of depatterning and behavioral modification that were used on adult subjects. These children had no capacity to consent to their participation and no understanding of the risks they faced, making their exploitation a particularly pure example of the program's disregard for human dignity. The geographic distribution of MKUltra experiments also revealed the systematic nature of the program's recruitment of vulnerable populations. Facilities in rural areas targeted patients from isolated communities who lacked access to legal representation or media attention. Urban hospitals focused on minority populations whose complaints were likely to be dismissed by authorities. Military hospitals experimented on soldiers who could be compelled to participate through military discipline and whose subsequent psychological problems could be attributed to combat stress. The transformation of healing institutions into centers of systematic abuse represented one of MKUltra's most enduring legacies, establishing precedents for the corruption of medical ethics that would influence intelligence operations for decades to come. The techniques developed through experimentation on psychiatric patients became standard components of interrogation training, while the institutional frameworks that had enabled these experiments provided templates for future violations of human rights under the cover of legitimate research. The helpless confusion of awakening without memory became more than just a recurring experience for individual victims. It became a metaphor for a society that had allowed its healing institutions to be corrupted in the service of intelligence objectives that bore no relationship to their ostensible mission of care. The sound of hospital gurneys on linoleum floors had become the soundtrack not just of medical treatment, but of systematic betrayal, marking the pathways through which vulnerable human beings were wheeled toward procedures designed to strip away their humanity in the name of national security. I remember the sterile air of military laboratories, how it carried the faint chemical temps of disinfectant and something else. Something that spoke of experiments conducted in rooms where questions of ethics had been suspended in the name of national defense. The weight of classified documents in steel filing cabinets seemed to press down on the corridors of Fort Detrick like a physical presence, each locked drawer containing secrets that would have horrified the American public if they had known what was being conducted in their name behind the chain-link fences and security checkpoints of this Maryland military installation. Fort Detrick represented the physical heart of MKUltra's operations, the place where Sidney Gottlieb had created what he called his hidden enclave within the legitimate structure of military research. Here, beneath the cover of biological warfare defense programs that Congress had approved and the public supported, the CIA had established laboratories where the boundaries between defensive research and offensive weapons development had been systematically erased. The CIA-Army partnership that enabled Fort Detrick's transformation into a mind control laboratory represented one of the most successful examples of institutional convergence in the history of American intelligence. The Army provided the physical infrastructure, security, and scientific personnel, while the CIA contributed funding, operational objectives, and protection from oversight. Gottlieb's office at Fort Detrick became the coordination center for experiments conducted at universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. From this central location, he could monitor progress reports, allocate funding, and ensure that research objectives remained aligned with the CIA's operational requirements. The physical layout of Fort Detrick reflected the compartmentalized nature of the research conducted there, with different buildings housing different aspects of the overall program. Building 439 contained LSD laboratories. Building 470 housed animal testing facilities. The administration building contained offices where research priorities were set and experimental results were analyzed. I remember the security protocols that governed access to these facilities, how they created layers of isolation that prevented even the researchers themselves from understanding the full scope of the programs in which they participated. Scientists working on chemical synthesis had no contact with those conducting psychological evaluations. The legitimate military research that provided cover for MKUltra's activities was itself substantial and scientifically sophisticated. Fort Detrick had been established during World War II as the Center for America's Biological Weapons Program, conducting research into anthrax, botulism, and other biological agents. Gottlieb's scientific background as a chemist gave him a unique perspective on the possibilities for chemical manipulation of human consciousness. His doctoral research at Columbia University had focused on plant diseases, giving him expertise in disrupting complex biological systems readily transferable to psychoactive substances research. The recruitment of scientific personnel for Fort Detrick's classified programs required attention to both technical qualifications and psychological suitability for work outside normal ethical constraints. Many were young scientists eager to advance their careers, attracted by unlimited funding and minimal oversight. The culture of secrecy that pervaded Fort Detrick extended beyond national security classification to encompass isolation. from ethical frameworks governing legitimate research, researchers were discouraged from publishing results or discussing their work, creating an environment where extreme ideas could flourish unchecked. I remember the procurement records that documented the vast array of chemical compounds, laboratory equipment, and research materials channeled through Fort Detrick to support MKUltra's experiments. Purchase orders for LSD were disguised as standard lab chemicals. Invoices for psychological testing equipment buried in conventional military budgets. The development of new psychoactive compounds represented one of MKUltra's most ambitious research efforts. Gottlieb's team sought to create substances that would be undetectable in routine medical examinations, produce precise psychological effects, and leave no trace in the subject after operation. Testing of these compounds followed protocols developed through years of experimentation on unwitting human subjects. Initial toxicity studies on animals, preliminary evaluations on volunteers, and full operational tests on unwitting individuals formed a systematic progression of research. Relationship between Fort Detrick's research and CIA operational requirements was maintained through weekly briefings. Feedback loops between lab findings and operational needs pushed the program toward increasingly extreme experimentation. Fort Detrick provided institutional legitimacy for MKUltra's activities. Military personnel could be compelled to participate. Hospitals could implement protocols without civilian review, and security ensured experiments remained hidden from oversight or journalists. Corruption of legitimate government infrastructure extended beyond facilities and personnel. Budgets were inflated to cover CIA activity, scientists diverted from defensive research, and academic ties were exploited to recruit personnel for ethically compromised programs. Annual reports documented Fort Detrick's systematic contribution to MKUltra objectives. New compounds, synthesized delivery mechanisms tested, psychological effects observed. Cumulative impact created a scientific foundation for psychological warfare. Fort Detrick's international collaborations extended influence beyond U.S. borders. Compounds developed in Maryland were tested in Canadian hospitals, European military facilities, and research centers worldwide, creating a global network of expertise in psychological manipulation. Environmental impact of Fort Detrick's experiments revealed the suspension of safety protocols, chemical waste disposed without care, experimental animals incinerated improperly, rural Maryland communities unknowingly at risk. The legacy of Fort Detrick's contribution to MKUltra extended beyond chemical and psychological techniques to broader questions about science and government power. The sterile air of those laboratories had carried the toxic atmosphere of institutional corruption, transforming healers into torturers and protectors into predators. I remember the vertigo of height, how it can seize the mind with a suddenness that transforms solid ground into an abyss of possibility. On the 13th floor of the Hotel Statler in Manhattan, in the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, that vertigo would claim the life of a man who had spent his career developing weapons designed to kill from a distance, never imagining that he himself would become a casualty of the very programs he had helped to create. Frank Rudolph Olson had awakened that morning as a man suspended between two realities, the rational world of scientific research that had defined his professional identity, and the chemically altered landscape of consciousness, that had been imposed upon him 9 days earlier without his knowledge or consent. The story of Olson's fall begins not with his final moments, but with his origins as a respected scientist working at the intersection of legitimate biological research and classified weapons development. His background at Fort Detrick had positioned him to understand both the promise and horror of America's chemical and biological weapons programs. Olson had joined the Chemical Corps at Fort Detrick in 1943, applying his training in biochemistry and bacteriology to defensive research. By the early 1950s, he had established himself as a leading expert in aerobiology, the science of how biological agents could be dispersed through air to maximum effect. The progression of Olson's career from defensive research to offensive weapons development mirrored the path of many MKUltra participants. His expertise made him a natural candidate for collaboration with the CIA's technical services staff, seeking methods to incapacitate or eliminate targets without trace. Performance evaluations describe Olson as conscientious, technically skilled, and ethically sensitive. These same qualities, which made him valuable, ultimately rendered him a potential threat to agency secrecy. The transformation from trusted insider to security risk began with participation in field tests, releasing supposedly harmless biological agents to assess delivery mechanisms. Olson's knowledge of these operations made him dangerous to those controlling classified programs. The psychological impact of field tests changed Olson's behavior. During 1950-53, he became withdrawn, questioning, and critical of research priorities. His wife Alice recalled growing doubts about the morality of his work and the direction of biological weapons programs. The CIA targeted Olson for covert LSD administration due to perceived security risks. On November 18, 1953, at a staff retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Olson and others were dosed without consent to test psychological effects and assess reliability. Sidney Gottlieb and senior CIA officials orchestrated the dosing as an experiment without informed consent. The LSD dissolved in after-dinner drinks caused confusion, paranoia, and terror as participants struggled to distinguish reality from hallucination. Olson's reaction to the covert dosing was severe, possibly due to pre-existing psychological stress. He became agitated and paranoid, expressing fears of being watched and suspicions that colleagues were plotting against him, suspicions that were, in fact, justified. The decision to reveal the true nature of the experiment came only after severe distress became evident. Gottlieb's admission that the drinks were spiked was framed as a collegial revelation rather than an acknowledgement of ethical violation. The 9 days between dosing and Olson's death were marked by erratic behavior, alarming to family and colleagues. Withdrawal, suspicion, and anxiety dominated his actions, reflecting both drug effects and intuition of altered trust relationships with his employers. The CIA prioritized containment over care. Olson was brought to New York for consultation with Dr. Harold Abramson, whose qualifications centered on LSD research under CIA contract rather than treatment of adverse reactions. The trip was orchestrated by CIA officer Robert Lashbrook, whose role was monitoring rather than providing care. Housing Olson at the Hotel Statler suggested containment rather than therapeutic intent. Olson's final hours reflected the struggle between rational awareness and chemically altered perception. Concerns about work, security, and family combined with LSD effects to create a psychological crisis beyond his coping capacity. Accounts of Olson's fall remain conflicting. Lashbrook claimed he was awakened by breaking glass to find Olson had crashed through the hotel window, implying spontaneous suicide, a narrative that served the CIA's institutional interests. Physical evidence suggested inconsistencies. The hotel window required force to break. The fall trajectory indicated horizontal velocity inconsistent with a simple jump, and no hesitation marks were present on the window frame. The immediate aftermath revealed CIA crisis management. NYPD briefed with an explanation avoiding LSD or classified research. Family told of a work-related mental breakdown, concealing the agency's role in precipitating his psychological crisis. Decades later, exhumation and forensic analysis revealed blunt force trauma, suggesting Olson may have been rendered unconscious before his fall. These findings contradicted the official suicide narrative and highlighted long-term institutional cover-up. The Rockefeller Commission's 1975 investigation revealed Olson had been covertly dosed with LSD. The report acknowledged wrongdoing but maintained that his death was a tragic suicide rather than a direct CIA consequence. President Gerald Ford delivered a personal apology to the Olson family, expressing regret and offering a financial settlement of $750,000. Legal provisions limited the family's ability to pursue further claims. Congressional investigations following the Rockefeller Commission provided additional details about Olson's death while continuing to maintain the suicide narrative despite emerging forensic inconsistencies. Physical evidence raised troubling questions. Contusions inconsistent with a simple fall, lack of defensive wounds, absence of glass fragments in clothing, all suggesting the possibility of foul play. Olson's exhumation in 1994 revealed blunt force trauma to the head, indicating he may have been rendered unconscious before being thrown from the window. This forensic evidence contradicted prior suicide claims. The CIA maintained the official position while acknowledging unexplained aspects of the case, citing the passage of time as justification, and continuing to deny any involvement in actions leading to Olson's death. Olson's death demonstrated that government employees with sensitive knowledge could become targets if their reliability was questioned, creating a climate of fear and undermining trust essential for research and operations. The combination of security classification, compartmentalization, and legal immunity protected the CIA from accountability. This framework would be replicated in future cases where agency actions harmed individuals unable to seek redress. The psychological impact on other MKUltra researchers created a climate of suspicion, reducing cooperation and eroding trust. Those who had previously served national security objectives began to fear that their own loyalty might be questioned. The vertigo of height that claimed Olson's life became a metaphor for the moral complexities of intelligence work. His fall symbolized not just personal tragedy, but the enduring human cost of unchecked government power and secret research programs. I remember the weight of unanswered questions surrounding Olson's death, how they accumulated over decades like sediment in a riverbed, gradually building a body of evidence challenging official narratives. The case tested whether democratic institutions could ultimately be held accountable for violations of trust, and whether families of victims could obtain justice despite systematic institutional resistance. The Hotel Statler itself was eventually demolished, its windows replaced by new construction. Physical traces vanished, but the questions raised by Olson's death endured, challenging authority long after the last fragments of broken glass had been swept away. The vertigo of height that claimed Olson became a symbol of moral complexity in intelligence work, where national security objectives justified violations of rights and professional ethics. His fall marked not only the end of a life, but the beginning of a broader recognition that institutions designed to protect democracy could themselves pose the greatest threat to the values they claimed to defend. The unanswered questions persisted. Was Olson suicide or homicide? Could the CIA's institutional safeguards be trusted? Each layer of obfuscation reinforced the difficulty of discerning truth. Eric Olson, Frank's son, dedicated much of his adult life to uncovering the truth, becoming an expert on MKUltra and challenging decades of institutional deception. The pursuit of truth spanned decades, involving legal battles, congressional hearings, and public advocacy, slowly peeling back layers of secrecy surrounding his father's death. The enduring narrative of Olson's life and death became emblematic of the human cost of unaccountable government power, a cautionary tale for both researchers and policymakers. The broken window of the Hotel Statler and the sharp November wind that had carried away Olson's life were gone, but the moral vertigo he embodied continued to challenge every generation, grappling with the balance between national security and human ethics. I remember the whisper of papers feeding into shredding machines, a sound that became the dominant rhythm of the Central Intelligence Agency during the winter and spring of 1973. The mechanical teeth of the document destroyers worked with relentless efficiency, transforming decades of classified research files into confetti that would be burned in incinerators or scattered to winds that carried no memory of the human suffering they had once documented. The finality of flames consuming evidence represented more than simple housekeeping, was the systematic erasure of institutional memory, a deliberate attempt to render invisible the most extensive program of illegal human experimentation ever conducted by the American government. Richard McGarrah Helms had assumed the directorship of the CIA in 1966, inheriting an agency whose reputation for competence and discretion was increasingly undermined by operational failures and public revelations about domestic surveillance programs. By 1973, the Watergate scandal had created a political environment where congressional oversight of intelligence activities was no longer a distant possibility but an immediate threat. The decision to destroy the MKUltra files represented Helms's calculated judgment that the program's exposure would inflict more damage on the agency than its concealment was worth. The whisper of papers feeding into shredding machines carried with it the accumulated weight of 20 years of classified research, thousands of individual experiments, and the documented suffering of subjects who had been reduced to data points in pursuit of psychological weapons that had never materialized. Each document that disappeared into the mechanical maw of the destruction process represented not just information, but human lives that had been systematically violated in service of objectives that even their architects had come to recognize as failures. The calculated nature of the evidence destruction revealed the institutional priorities that had driven MKUltra from its inception. Helms's order was not motivated by shame about the programs, methods, or concern for its victims, but rather by pragmatic recognition that exposure would damage the agency's effectiveness and credibility. The same institutional logic that had justified human experimentation now justified its concealment, treating the program's subjects as expendable both during its operation and after its termination. The mechanics of the destruction process demonstrated the systematic thoroughness with which the CIA approached the elimination of potentially embarrassing evidence. The order affected not just MKUltra's central files, but also related documents scattered throughout the agency's various directorates and support offices. Financial records that might have revealed the program's true scope, correspondence with academic collaborators who might have been compromised by their participation, and medical files documenting the effects of experimental procedures on individual subjects all were fed into the machines that reduced institutional memory to paper fragments. I remember reading Helms's internal memorandum authorizing the destruction, how its bureaucratic language attempted to transform criminal evidence destruction into routine administrative procedure. The stated justification was the need to protect relationships with outsiders who had participated in agency programs, a euphemistic reference to the academic researchers, medical professionals, and institutional administrators whose collaboration had enabled MKUltra's most extensive violations of research ethics and human rights. The protection of relationships with outsiders represented more than simple consideration for collaborators who might be embarrassed by disclosure of their participation. These individuals possessed detailed knowledge of the program's methods and objectives that could have supported criminal prosecutions, congressional investigations, and civil lawsuits that would have exposed the full scope of the agency's illegal activities. Their continued cooperation required assurance that their participation would remain secret, making document destruction a form of institutional insurance policy. The systematic nature of the file destruction also reflected lessons learned from earlier intelligence scandals about the vulnerability of written records to discovery through legal proceedings and congressional investigations, the extensive documentation that had been maintained throughout MKUltra's operation, detailed experimental protocols, progress reports, financial records, and correspondence with research collaborators represented a comprehensive record of illegal activity that could have supported criminal charges against hundreds of individuals and dozens of institutions. The timing of the destruction, occurring in January 1973, placed it squarely within the political crisis created by the Watergate break-in and its aftermath. The revelations about White House involvement in domestic surveillance and political espionage had created an atmosphere of suspicion about intelligence activities that extended far beyond the specific crimes associated with the Nixon administration. Congressional leaders were beginning to discuss the need for systematic oversight of intelligence operations, making the preservation of MKUltra files an unacceptable risk. The near-total eradication of the program's documentary record encompassed more than 150 separate sub-projects that had been conducted over 2 decades in facilities across the United States and Canada. The destroyed files included not just the central administrative records maintained at CIA headquarters, but also detailed research files that had been maintained at participating institutions. Universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research facilities were contacted and instructed to destroy any records that might connect them to the agency's psychological warfare programs. I remember the inventory lists that documented the scope of the destruction, how they revealed the vast bureaucratic infrastructure that had supported MKUltra's operations. Administrative files, financial records, research reports, correspondence, personnel evaluations, security assessments, the accumulated paperwork of 20 years of illegal research filled dozens of filing cabinets and storage areas that were systematically emptied during the first months of 1973. The destruction process itself was conducted with the same compartmentalized secrecy that had characterized MKUltra's original operations. Different aspects of the file elimination were assigned to different personnel, ensuring that no single individual gained comprehensive knowledge of what was being destroyed or why. The CIA's Office of Security oversaw the physical destruction of documents, while the technical services staff handled the elimination of research files, and the Office of General Counsel managed correspondence with outside institutions that needed to destroy related records. The survival of approximately 20,000 misfiled documents represented the only significant failure in an otherwise comprehensive elimination of evidence. These records, which had been incorrectly stored in financial files rather than operational archives, escaped destruction only because they were not located during the systematic search for MKUltra-related materials. Their accidental preservation would prove crucial to later investigations, providing the documentary foundation for congressional hearings and legal proceedings that would finally expose the program's scope and methods. The misfiled documents that survived the purge included financial records that revealed the program's budget and funding mechanisms, correspondence between CIA personnel and research collaborators that documented the agency's role in human experimentation, and progress reports that described specific experimental procedures and their effects on individual subjects, while representing only a fraction of the program's original documentation. These surviving records provided sufficient detail to reconstruct the basic outlines of MKUltra's activities and identify many of the institutions and individuals who had participated. The institutional amnesia that the document destruction was intended to create extended beyond the elimination of written records to encompass efforts to discourage or prevent former program participants from discussing their involvement in classified research. Researchers who had worked on MKUltra projects were reminded of their continuing security obligations and warned that unauthorized disclosure could result in criminal prosecution. Academic institutions that had hosted CIA-funded research were advised that their continued eligibility for federal funding might depend on their discretion about past activities. The destruction of evidence also eliminated crucial documentation that could have supported compensation claims by individuals who had been subjected to experimental procedures without their knowledge or consent. Medical records that might have established causal connections between CIA experiments and subsequent psychological problems were systematically destroyed, making it nearly impossible for victims to prove that their injuries resulted from government actions rather than pre-existing conditions or other causes. I remember the testimony of CIA officials who appeared before congressional committees in the mid-1970s, how they consistently claimed that their inability to provide detailed information about MKUltra resulted from the unfortunate but routine destruction of old files rather than deliberate evidence elimination. These claims of administrative housekeeping were contradicted by the systematic nature of the extraction and its timing during a period of increasing congressional scrutiny of intelligence activities. The bureaucratic efficiency demonstrated in the destruction process revealed the same institutional capabilities that had enabled MKUltra's original operations. The agency's ability to coordinate simultaneous elimination of records at dozens of facilities across multiple states demonstrated the effectiveness of the administrative infrastructure that had supported 20 years of illegal research. The same networks of communication and authority that had enabled human experimentation now enabled its concealment. The protection of institutional reputation that motivated the document destruction also reflected the agency's understanding that MKUltra's exposure would undermine public confidence in intelligence operations more generally. The program's systematic violation of ethical and legal constraints suggested institutional corruption that extended far beyond any individual operation or personnel decision. The revelation that respected academic institutions and medical professionals had participated in illegal human experimentation would damage public trust in scientific research and professional authority more broadly. The international dimensions of the document destruction included efforts to coordinate with foreign intelligence services and research institutions that had participated in MKUltra-related programs. The CIA's relationships with Canadian institutions like Allen Memorial Institute required careful management to ensure that foreign records that might implicate American personnel were also eliminated. Similar coordination was necessary with European institutions that had received CIA funding for psychological research during the Cold War period. The legal implications of the evidence destruction extended beyond simple obstruction of justice to encompass systematic elimination of documentation that could have supported both criminal prosecutions and civil liability claims. The destroyed files included records of financial transactions that might have constituted fraud, correspondence that might have demonstrated conspiracy to violate civil rights, and medical documentation that might have supported claims of assault and battery against individual subjects. The fragility of historical truth revealed by the document destruction demonstrated how easily institutional memory could be manipulated when powerful organizations were willing to sacrifice accuracy for protection. The near-complete elimination of MKUltra's documentary record meant that later investigators would be forced to reconstruct the program's activities from fragmentary evidence. Interviews with participants whose memories had faded or been deliberately altered, and secondary sources that might not reflect the full scope of what had actually occurred. The timing of the destruction also reflected awareness that the political climate created by Watergate would not last indefinitely, and that future congressional investigations might be conducted with different priorities and less intensive oversight. The elimination of evidence during a period of maximum political vulnerability ensured that later investigations would be handicapped by lack of documentation, regardless of their political mandate or investigative resources. I remember the reports from CIA personnel who participated in the destruction, how they described the mechanical process of feeding documents into shredders and incinerators with the same detachment that had characterized their participation in the original research programs. The institutional culture that had enabled human experimentation also enabled its concealment, treating evidence elimination as simply another operational requirement that needed to be accomplished efficiently and completely. The finality of flames consuming evidence marked not the end of MKUltra's impact, but rather the beginning of a new phase in which concealment and denial would become primary strategies for managing the program's legacy. the institutional capabilities that had enabled 20 years of illegal research had been successfully redeployed to enable its concealment, demonstrating the resilience of bureaucratic systems that prioritized self-protection over accountability to the democratic institutions they ostensibly served. The rustle of newspapers hitting doorsteps across America carried with it something different in the winter of 1974. Not just the thud of rolled paper against concrete, but the weight of revelations that would reshape how citizens viewed their government. The Watergate scandal had torn away the curtain of executive privilege, and in its wake came a hunger for truth that would reach into the darkest corners of the intelligence community. I remember the quality of light in those congressional hearing rooms, harsh, fluorescent, unforgiving. It was the kind of illumination that left nowhere to hide, that stripped away the comfortable shadows where secrets had lived for decades. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 would become a theater of national reckoning, where senators with grave faces would listen to testimonies that sounded more like science fiction than government policy. The atmosphere in Washington had changed fundamentally after Nixon's resignation. The imperial presidency lay in ruins, and with it the assumption that national security justified any action, no matter how extreme. Senator Frank Church of Idaho, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to uncomfortable truths, had accepted the chairmanship of the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. The name was bureaucratic, but the mission was revolutionary: to examine 30 years of intelligence activities that had operated in almost complete secrecy. Church understood the historical moment. The United States must not adopt the tactics of the enemy, he would say, his voice echoing in those bright hearing rooms. The question is whether democracy can survive in an age when the power of government is vastly expanded, and when secrecy has become the norm rather than the exception. The committee had not set out specifically to uncover MKUltra, like archaeologists stumbling upon a hidden tomb. They had been investigating broader patterns of intelligence abuse when the mind control experiments began to surface. The first hints came from former CIA employees willing to break decades of silence, their testimonies creating a paper trail that led investigators deeper into the labyrinth of psychological warfare research. William Colby, the CIA director who had inherited this toxic legacy, faced an impossible choice. He could either cooperate with the investigation and reveal decades of illegal activities, or stonewall and risk even greater exposure when the truth inevitably emerged. Colby chose cooperation, a decision that would cost him his career but preserve some measure of institutional credibility. In his measured bureaucratic language, he began to outline programs that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The revelations came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last. There had been programs to develop truth serums, projects to explore hypnosis and sensory deprivation, experiments with drugs that could erase memory or create programmed assassins. The testimony created a strange cognitive dissonance. Respected officials, speaking in clinical terms about research that violated every ethical standard of medical practice and human rights. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb appeared before the committee like a figure from a different era, his slight frame and mild demeanor at odds with his role as the architect of psychological warfare. He spoke in the measured tones of a scientist discussing laboratory procedures, rarely acknowledging that his test subjects had been human beings. His testimony was carefully crafted, revealing enough to satisfy legal requirements while protecting the operational details that might still be classified. We were not being frivolous, Gottlieb explained to the senators, his voice barely above a whisper in the microphone. These were serious times with serious people, and we were trying to do serious work. The banality of his language only heightened the horror of what he was describing, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable human beings in the name of national defense. The committee members struggled to comprehend the scope of what they were hearing. MKUltra had operated for 20 years across 185 different projects involving hospitals, universities, prisons, and military installations. The experiments had included administration of LSD to unwitting subjects, attempts to create programmed assassins through hypnosis, and research into techniques that could completely erase an individual's personality. Senator Church himself seemed stunned by the breadth of the program. The question, he said during one hearing, is not whether foreign intelligence agencies were experimenting with mind control techniques. The question is whether the United States should have been doing the same thing, and doing it to its own citizens without their knowledge or consent. The parallel investigation by the Rockefeller Commission, led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, had focused more narrowly on CIA activities within the United States, but their findings corroborated and expanded upon the Church Committee's discoveries. The Commission's final report, delivered in June 1975, contained a chapter devoted to drug testing programs that read like a catalogue of medical ethics violations. Perhaps most shocking to the public was the revelation that the CIA had operated brothels in San Francisco and New York as part of Operation Midnight Climax, using unwitting customers as test subjects for LSD experiments. The image of government agents watching through one-way mirrors as American citizens were unknowingly dosed with mind-altering drugs became a symbol of how far the intelligence community had strayed from democratic principles. The hearings also revealed the broader institutional failure that had enabled these programs. Universities had accepted CIA funding without asking questions about the research being conducted. Medical professionals had participated in experiments that violated the Nuremberg Code established after World War II. Military installations had provided cover and resources for activities that had no connection to legitimate defense purposes. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal received particular scrutiny. The committee learned that American citizens had been subjected to Cameron's depatterning techniques, emerging from treatment with their memories destroyed and their personalities fundamentally altered. The CIA had funded this research through front organizations, maintaining plausible deniability while supporting some of the most extreme experiments in the entire MKUltra program. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Editorial pages across the country condemned the revelations as a betrayal of democratic principles. The New York Times called it a series of medical experiments that were not only scientifically questionable, but morally repugnant. The Washington Post described the programs as representing the kind of activities we have condemned when practiced by totalitarian governments. But perhaps more significant than the editorial condemnation was the deeper cultural shift the revelations represented. Americans had been forced to confront the possibility that their own government was capable of the kinds of systematic human rights abuses they associated with foreign dictatorships. The comfortable assumption that such things could never happen here had been permanently shattered. The legal implications were equally profound. Families of victims began filing lawsuits against the government, demanding compensation for decades of cover-up and denial. The cases faced enormous obstacles. Many records had been destroyed. Victims had died or suffered permanent psychological damage that made testimony difficult, and the government claimed various forms of immunity and classification privileges. Yet some cases did proceed. The family of Frank Olson, the scientist who had died after being secretly dosed with LSD, pursued their legal battle with particular determination. Their case would eventually lead to a presidential apology and financial settlement, but only after decades of legal warfare that revealed the extraordinary lengths to which the government would go to protect its secrets. The Church Committee's final report, published in 1976, ran to 14 volumes and nearly 4,000 pages. But for all its comprehensiveness, the committee members acknowledged that they had uncovered only a portion of the truth. Too many records had been destroyed. Too many participants had died or refused to cooperate. Too many activities had been compartmentalized and hidden from oversight. Senator Church himself seemed haunted by what the investigation had revealed. In his closing statement, he reflected on the broader implications of what they had discovered. We have seen segments of our government to their attitudes and action unworthy of a democracy and occasionally reminiscent of the tactics of totalitarian regimes. The committee's recommendations were sweeping new oversight mechanisms, clear legal boundaries for intelligence activities, and protections for the rights of American citizens. But even as these reforms were being implemented, questions lingered about how many other programs remained hidden. How many other violations of human rights and democratic principles had not yet been discovered? The investigative journalists who had helped break the story continued their work with a new sense of purpose. Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, who had first exposed the CIA's domestic surveillance programs, understood that the MKUltra revelations were part of a larger pattern of intelligence abuse. His reporting helped maintain public pressure for continued investigation and reform. The Freedom of Information Act, strengthened in the wake of Watergate, became a crucial tool for researchers and journalists seeking to understand the full scope of the mind control programs. The discovery of those 20,000 surviving documents in 1977 would provide additional details about the scope and methods of MKUltra, but it also highlighted how much had been permanently lost to deliberate destruction. For the victims and their families, the congressional hearings represented both vindication and frustration. Their suffering had finally been acknowledged publicly. Their stories of inexplicable medical procedures and psychological abuse had been confirmed by government documents. But the acknowledgement came decades too late for many, and the full extent of what they had endured would never be completely understood. The international implications were equally significant. The revelation that the CIA had conducted illegal experiments on Canadian citizens at the Allen Memorial Institute created a diplomatic crisis that would persist for years. The Canadian government faced its own questions about how much it had known about Cameron's activities and why it had failed to protect its citizens from American intelligence operations on Canadian soil. As 1977 dawned, the immediate crisis of revelation was beginning to fade into the longer process of institutional reform. New oversight committees had been established in both houses of Congress. New guidelines governed intelligence activities. New legal protections were put in place for American citizens. But the deeper questions raised by the MKUltra revelations would continue to resonate through American political culture for decades to come. The hearings had forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity of their institutions for abuse and self-deception. The scientists who had conducted the experiments had been respected members of their professions. The officials who had authorized them had been dedicated public servants. The oversight mechanisms that should have prevented them had been staffed by well-meaning individuals who had simply looked the other way. In the end, the Church Committee hearings represented both the best and worst of American democracy. They demonstrated the system's capacity for self-correction and accountability, its ability to confront even the most uncomfortable truths about government misconduct, but they also revealed how easily democratic institutions could be corrupted by fear and secrecy, how quickly the protection of national security could become a justification for any action, no matter how extreme. The harsh, fluorescent lights of those hearing rooms had illuminated more than just the specific crimes of MKUltra. They had revealed the fragility of the ethical foundations that separate democratic governments from their totalitarian rivals. The question that lingered as the immediate crisis passed was whether the lessons learned would be remembered when the next national emergency arose, when fear once again tempted officials to abandon the principles they had sworn to protect. The quiet of library archives has a particular quality, the whisper of turning pages, the soft thud of volumes being reshelved, the hushed conversations of researchers discovering fragments of forgotten history. In the years following the congressional revelations, these academic sanctuaries became unexpected battlegrounds where the true meaning of MKUltra would be contested and shaped for future generations. I find myself drawn to these spaces where the official record meets the cultural imagination, where documented fact transforms into something larger and more elusive. The story of MKUltra's legacy is not simply the story of what the program achieved or failed to achieve in its original objectives. It is the story of how a democracy processes the discovery that its most trusted institutions have betrayed its fundamental values. The immediate question that emerged from the congressional hearings was perhaps the most disturbing. Had any of it worked? After 2 decades of experimentation, millions of dollars in funding, and immeasurable human suffering, had the CIA actually developed the mind control capabilities that had justified the program in the first place? The answer, delivered in the dry language of intelligence assessments, was a resounding no. There would be no programmed assassins emerging from MKUltra laboratories, no truth serums that could reliably extract secrets from enemy agents, no techniques for erasing and rebuilding human personality that could be deployed operationally against foreign targets. The grand vision that had inspired Sidney Gottlieb and his colleagues, the dream of reducing human consciousness to a set of variables that could be manipulated at will, had proven to be a scientific fantasy. This failure was perhaps the most damning indictment of the entire program. The experiments had been conducted not just in violation of medical ethics and human rights, but in pursuit of goals that were fundamentally impossible to achieve. The complexity of human consciousness, the resilience of personality, the unpredictability of psychological responses, all of these factors that any ethical researcher would have identified as reasons to proceed with extreme caution, had simply been ignored in the rush to weaponize the human mind. Dr. John Marks, whose book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, would become one of the definitive accounts of MKUltra, spent years interviewing former CIA officials and trying to understand how intelligent, educated people could have convinced themselves that such research was both necessary and achievable. His conclusion was sobering. The combination of Cold War paranoia and scientific hubris had created a kind of institutional delusion that made rational assessment impossible. They were chasing something that didn't exist. Marx would later reflect, but they were so convinced that the Soviets had cracked the code of human consciousness that they were willing to try anything to catch up. The tragedy is that they destroyed so many lives pursuing something that was never possible in the first place. The legal aftermath of the revelations proved almost as complex as the original program. Victims and their families faced enormous obstacles in seeking compensation for the damage they had suffered. Many of the most seriously injured subjects had been psychiatric patients, whose pre-existing conditions made it difficult to prove that CIA experiments had caused their deterioration. Others had died years earlier, leaving family members to piece together fragmentary evidence of what had been done to their loved ones. The case of Velma Orlico, a Canadian woman who had been subjected to Donald Ewan Cameron's Depatterning experiments, illustrates the challenges faced by MKUltra victims. Orlico had entered the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal in 1956, seeking treatment for depression following a difficult pregnancy. She emerged months later with no memory of her husband, her children, or her previous life. She had to relearn basic skills like reading and writing, and never fully recovered her former personality. When the CIA's role in funding Cameron's research was revealed, Orlico joined 8 other Canadian victims in a lawsuit against the agency. The case dragged on for years, with the CIA arguing that it bore no responsibility for the actions of independent contractors and that the experiments had been conducted outside US territory. Eventually, in 1988, the agency agreed to an out-of-court settlement that provided $750,000 to be divided among the 9 plaintiffs, for roughly $80,000 each, for lives that had been fundamentally destroyed. Similar cases in the United States faced even greater obstacles. The doctrine of sovereign immunity provided broad protection for government agencies, and judges were often reluctant to second-guess national security decisions, even those that had clearly violated the law. The family of Frank Olson received a presidential apology and a $750,000 settlement in 1975, but this came only after years of pressure and the personal intervention of CIA Director William Colby. Perhaps more significant than the legal battles was the transformation of ethical standards in medical research. That MKUltra's exposure helped to accelerate the revelation that respected physicians and psychologists had participated in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, created a crisis of confidence that forced fundamental changes in how research involving human subjects was conducted and overseen. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II to prevent the kind of medical experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps, had apparently provided insufficient protection against American researchers operating under the banner of national security. New institutional review boards were established to evaluate proposed research. Informed consent procedures were strengthened and standardized. The principle that subjects must be told the true nature of any experiment in which they were participating became an inviolable rule rather than a flexible guideline. Dr. J. Katz of Yale University, one of the leading medical ethicists of his generation, saw the MKUltra revelations as a turning point in the relationship between medical professionals and society. The experiments represented a fundamental betrayal of trust, he argued. Patients had entered hospitals and clinics seeking healing, and instead they had been used as test subjects in research that was designed not to help them, but to advance the political objectives of intelligence agencies. The academic world faced its own reckoning. Universities that had accepted CIA funding for MKUltra research found themselves defending their failure to ask adequate questions about the purposes and methods of the work they were hosting. The revelation that some of the most prestigious institutions in American higher education had essentially served as front organizations for intelligence operations created a lasting suspicion about the relationship between academia and government that persists to this day. The cultural impact of the MKUltra revelations proved even more profound than the legal and institutional changes they inspired. The program became a touchstone for a broader loss of faith in government authority that had begun with Vietnam and Watergate, but reached new depths with the mind control revelations. The idea that the CIA had been secretly experimenting on American citizens fit perfectly into a growing narrative about institutional betrayal and government conspiracy. Hollywood was quick to capitalize on the public fascination with mind control themes. Films like The Manchurian Candidate, originally released in 1962, but gaining new relevance after the MKUltra revelations, explored the possibility of programmed assassins and psychological manipulation. The Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor depicted intelligence agencies as rogue organizations operating beyond democratic control. These fictional portrayals often exaggerated the actual capabilities demonstrated by MKUltra research, but they captured something real about the public mood in the post-Watergate era. The glow of movie screens in darkened theaters became a new venue for processing collective anxiety about hidden control and institutional power. Audiences who might never read a congressional report or follow the details of a legal settlement could absorb the essential message through entertainment. Their government was capable of treating its own citizens as expendable test subjects in the pursuit of political objectives. This cultural processing of the MKUltra legacy created its own distortions. The actual limitations of the CIA's mind control research were often lost in fictional portrayals that suggested far greater capabilities than the program had ever achieved. The failure of most MKUltra experiments became less important in the popular imagination than the intention behind them, the willingness of intelligence. Officials to treat human consciousness as a battlefield to be conquered and controlled. Conspiracy theories flourished in this environment, with MKUltra serving as proof that even more extensive programs of mind control must be operating in secret. The very fact that such an extreme program had been hidden for decades seemed to validate suspicions about other forms of government manipulation and control. Academic researchers studying the program faced the challenge of separating documented facts from speculation and mythology. The 20,000 surviving documents provided crucial evidence about the scope and methods of MKUltra research, but they represented only a fraction of the original record. Researchers had to work with fragmentary evidence, survivor testimony that was often incomplete or unreliable due to the psychological damage inflicted by the experiments themselves, and official accounts that were carefully crafted to minimize legal and political liability. Dr. Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin became one of the leading academic experts on CIA torture research, tracing the connections between MKUltra experiments and the interrogation techniques, later codified in the Kubak Manual and employed in settings from Vietnam to Latin America. His work revealed that while the mind control objectives of MKUltra had failed, the program had succeeded in developing psychological torture techniques that would be used by American intelligence agencies for decades. The real legacy of MKUltra wasn't mind control, McCoy argued. It was the systematic study of how to break down human psychological resistance. The CIA may not have learned how to program assassins, but they did learn how to destroy people's capacity to resist interrogation. That knowledge was institutionalized and passed on to future generations of intelligence officers. This insight pointed to one of the most troubling aspects of MKUltra's legacy: the way that techniques developed through unethical experimentation on unwilling subjects had been incorporated into standard intelligence practices. The sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation techniques tested on psychiatric patients and prisoners during the MKUltra era would later appear in CIA interrogation manuals and be employed against suspected terrorists and enemy combatants. The institutional memory of these techniques proved remarkably persistent, even as the original mind control objectives were abandoned. Intelligence officers who had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb or Donald Ewan, Cameron would employ psychological techniques that had been developed through their research. The knowledge gained through illegal experimentation on American and Canadian citizens became part of the permanent toolkit of American intelligence operations. International observers watched the American response to the MKUltra revelations with fascination and concern. European allies, already troubled by revelations about CIA operations in their countries, saw the mind control experiments as evidence of a dangerous American willingness to treat human rights as expendable in the pursuit of intelligence objectives. The fact that some experiments had been conducted on foreign soil without the knowledge or consent of Allied governments created lasting diplomatic tensions. The Soviet Union predictably seized on the MKUltra revelations as evidence of American hypocrisy in criticizing Soviet human rights violations. The fact that American officials had spent decades condemning communist brainwashing techniques while secretly developing their own mind control programs provided powerful ammunition for Soviet propaganda efforts. But perhaps the most significant international impact was the way the MKUltra revelations influenced global standards for research ethics and human rights protection. The exposure of American mind control experiments contributed to the development of international protocols for medical research and helped strengthen the global consensus against non-consensual human experimentation. As the immediate shock of the revelations faded, a more complex process of historical assessment began. Scholars and journalists worked to place MKUltra in the broader context of Cold War intelligence operations and American political culture. The program began to be seen not as an aberration, but as an extreme example of tendencies that were deeply embedded in American institutions and ideology. The quiet of those library archives where researchers continued to study MKUltra documents held within it the echo of these unanswered questions. The program had ended, but its legacy lived on in the transformed relationship between American citizens and their government, in the changed standards for medical research and intelligence operations, and in the persistent cultural anxiety about hidden forms of control and manipulation. The weight of unanswered questions settles differently in different seasons. In the autumn of 1977, as leaves fell across the campuses where MKUltra experiments had been conducted and the corridors where they had been authorized, there was a quality of incompleteness that hung in the air like morning mist. Not the incompleteness of ongoing investigation, but the deeper incompleteness that comes when a society realizes that some questions may never be fully answered. I find myself returning to this sense of historical incompleteness, to the silence where records once existed, to the gaps in testimony where memory fails or fear intervenes. The story of MKUltra is, in many ways, the story of what we can never fully know about the exercise of power in secret, about the human cost of ideological certainty, about the institutional dynamics that can transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary cruelty. The shredding machines that had consumed most of the MKUltra files in 1973 had done more than destroy evidence. They had created a permanent uncertainty about the full scope of what had been attempted, what had been achieved, and what had been covered up. The 20,000 surviving documents provided glimpses into a vast program of human experimentation, but they were fragments of a much larger mosaic that would never be completely reconstructed. This incompleteness was not accidental. Richard Helms's decision to destroy the files had been calculated to protect not just specific operations or individual careers, but the institutional capacity of the CIA to continue functioning without complete public accountability. The destruction had been successful in this narrow sense. The agency had survived the revelations and continued to operate with broad public support. But it had also ensured that American society would never fully understand what had been done in its name. The families of victims lived with this uncertainty in the most personal terms. Children who had watched their parents deteriorate after mysterious medical treatments would never know exactly what had been done to them. Spouses who had seen fundamental personality changes in their partners following psychiatric hospitalization would never receive complete explanations. The absence of documentation became another form of injury, denying survivors and their families the closure that comes with understanding. Dr. Ewan Cameron's patients at the Allen Memorial Institute exemplified this ongoing trauma. Linda MacDonald, who had entered Cameron's care as a young mother and emerged unable to recognize her own children, spent decades trying to piece together what had happened to her during months of drug-induced comas and psychological conditioning. The fragmentary records that survived provided only partial answers, leaving her with memories that felt more like fragments of a dream than lived experience. "I know something terrible was done to me," MacDonald would later testify, "but I'll never know the full extent of it. They took that knowledge with them when they destroyed the files. They took away not just my memory, but my right to remember." This denial of the right to remember became one of MKUltra's most enduring legacies. The program had not only violated the bodies and minds of its subjects, but had also violated their relationship to their own histories. The destruction of records had extended the original injury indefinitely into the future, ensuring that the harm inflicted could never be fully acknowledged or addressed. The institutional lessons of MKUltra were clearer than its human cost, but even these proved difficult to apply consistently. The congressional investigations had revealed systemic failures of oversight that went far beyond any individual program or agency. Universities had accepted funding without asking adequate questions about the research being conducted. medical professionals had abandoned basic ethical principles in pursuit of scientific advancement. Government officials had authorized programs that violated fundamental constitutional rights with minimal review or accountability. The reforms implemented in response to these failures were substantial but incomplete. New oversight committees were established in Congress, but they depended on the willingness of intelligence agencies to provide accurate and complete information about their activities. New ethical standards were created for medical research, but they could not retroactively undo the damage that had already been inflicted. New legal protections were put in place for American citizens, but they contained exceptions for national security activities that could potentially be invoked to justify future abuses. Senator Frank Church, whose committee had done so much to expose the scope of intelligence community abuses, understood the limitations of legislative solutions. Laws and oversight mechanisms are only as effective as the people who implement them, he observed. The ultimate protection against abuse is not institutional, but cultural. It lies in the willingness of ordinary citizens to demand accountability from their government, and the willingness of government officials to respect the rights of those they serve. This cultural dimension of reform proved to be the most complex and contested aspect of the post-MKUltra reckoning. The revelations had shattered many Americans' faith in government institutions, but they had not produced consensus about what should replace that faith. Some saw the exposure of MKUltra as evidence that democratic institutions were ultimately capable of self-correction. Others saw it as proof that such institutions could not be trusted to police themselves effectively. The emergence of what would later be called the national security state, as a permanent feature of American government, had created new challenges for democratic accountability that the Founding Fathers had never anticipated. The combination of permanent military readiness, extensive intelligence capabilities, and broad claims of executive privilege had produced a shadow government that operated according to different rules than the constitutional system it was supposed to protect. MKUltra had emerged from this shadow system, and its exposure had revealed how easily the protection of national security could become a justification for abandoning the principles that gave American democracy its legitimacy. The question that lingered after the immediate crisis had passed was whether the reforms implemented in the 1970 South would prove sufficient to prevent similar abuses when future national emergencies created new temptations to sacrifice individual rights for collective security. The international dimensions of this question were equally troubling. The MKUltra revelations had damaged American credibility in criticizing human rights violations by other countries, but they had also contributed to the development of international standards that might prevent similar abuses in the future. The exposure of American mind control experiments had helped strengthen global norms against non-consensual human experimentation, and had provided ammunition for human rights advocates working to establish international oversight mechanisms. Yet the same technological and scientific capabilities that had made MKUltra possible were continuing to develop in ways that created new opportunities for abuse. Advances in pharmacology, psychology, and neuroscience were providing ever more sophisticated tools for influencing human behavior and consciousness. The question was whether the ethical frameworks developed in response to MKUltra's exposure would prove adequate to govern these new capabilities. The role of scientific and medical professionals in MKUltra had revealed how easily professional ethics could be compromised. When they came into conflict with political objectives or career advancement, the researchers who had participated in mind control experiments had not seen themselves as violating professional standards, but as contributing to important national security objectives. Their willingness to rationalize participation in unethical research had been facilitated by institutional structures that rewarded compliance and discouraged questioning of authority. The transformation of research ethics that followed the MKUltra revelations was designed to prevent such rationalization in the future. But it depended ultimately on the willingness of individual researchers to place ethical obligations above political pressures. The history of MKUltra suggested that such willingness could not be taken for granted, particularly when national security concerns were involved. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, the psychiatrist who had studied the psychology of professionals who participated in atrocities, saw the MKUltra revelations as illustrating what he called the doubling of professional identity. Researchers had maintained their sense of themselves as ethical professionals, while simultaneously participating in unethical experiments by compartmentalizing these activities and viewing them as separate from their normal professional roles. The doctors and psychologists who participated in MKUltra didn't see themselves as torturers or human rights violators. Lifton observed, they saw themselves as patriots and scientists contributing to the defense of their country. This capacity for self-deception is one of the most dangerous aspects of institutional evil. It allows good people to do terrible things while maintaining their sense of moral integrity. This psychological dimension of institutional abuse proved to be one of the most persistent challenges in preventing future MKUltras. Legal and ethical frameworks could establish clear boundaries for acceptable behavior, but they could not easily address the psychological and cultural factors that allowed individuals to rationalize crossing those boundaries when they believed the stakes were high enough. The Cold War context that had given birth to MKUltra was already beginning to shift by the late 1970s, but the basic dynamics of ideological conflict that had justified the program remained unchanged. American officials continued to believe that their country faced existential threats from foreign enemies, who would use any means necessary to achieve their objectives. The temptation to respond to such threats by adopting the same methods remained strong even after the exposure of MKUltra had demonstrated the moral and practical costs of such approaches. The ongoing relevance of these dynamics became clear in subsequent decades as new national security challenges emerged. The techniques developed through MKUltra research would resurface in different forms during the conflicts in Central America, the Persian Gulf, and the global war on terrorism. The psychological torture methods that had been refined through experiments on unwilling subjects in the 1950s and 1960s would be employed against suspected terrorists and enemy combatants in the 2000s. The cultural legacy of MKUltra proved more enduring than its institutional reforms. The program had become a symbol of government overreach and institutional betrayal that resonated far beyond the specific historical context in which it had operated. References to MKUltra appeared in popular culture, political discourse, and conspiracy theories as shorthand for the capacity of government to abuse its own citizens in pursuit of hidden agendas. The silence where MKUltra records once existed will always limit our understanding of what was done in the program's name. But the questions it raised about power, ethics, and democratic governance remain as relevant today as they were when Sidney Gottlieb first began his experiments in the 1950s. The challenge for each generation is to remain vigilant against the temptations that produced MKUltra, while preserving the democratic values and institutions that ultimately exposed and ended it. The silence where MKUltra records once existed will always limit our understanding of what was done in the program's name. But the questions it raised about power, ethics, and democratic governance remain as relevant today as they were when Sidney Gottlieb first began his experiments in the 1950s. The challenge for each generation is to remain vigilant against the temptations that produced MKUltra, while preserving the democratic values and institutions that ultimately exposed and ended it. The weight of these unanswered questions will continue to settle differently in different seasons, in different political climates, in different moments of national crisis and calm. But their persistence is itself a form of protection, a reminder that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance, but the willingness to ask difficult questions about the exercise of power, even when those questions challenge comfortable assumptions about the nature of comfortable asleep. Well of sleep well, sleep well, 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 was a well, bow, wow, 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 look, bow, wow, with bow, with well, 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 at will, oh, oh, wow, well, wow, come up, what up, go, oh, walk up, whoa, oh, walk up, there are more stories to come.